Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, we should be live. I'm going to double check that we are coming through. We'll just give people a minute or so to join, and then I'll get started with the opening address. Great. Looks like we're coming through live on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us today, everyone who is now here. Those of you who saw mine and Lawrence's pre-conference live stream on the channel will know that I do occasionally have technical slip-ups. So let's hope that there aren't too many of those this weekend. Yeah, that's been a minute or so we'll crack on. So yes, welcome everyone to the very first Antinatalist Advocacy Conference, Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023, Antinatalism at a Crossroads. By now, most of you will know that I'm John Williams, one of the co-founders of Antinatalist Advocacy, and I'll be hosting this conference with my other co-founder, Lawrence Anton, who will be hosting the first session shortly. Together, we'll be hosting this conference over this 2-day period, and we're very grateful that you've all decided to join us for it. I'll begin this opening address by introducing Antinatalist Advocacy as an organization. We seek to help protect sentient beings from the harms of coming into existence. We advocate refraining from creating new sentient beings, as well as improving the lives of those who exist now and will exist in the future. More specifically, we have 3 overarching aims that drive our actions. The first is to encourage the antinatalist community to adopt an evidence-based, impact-driven approach to activism, and we hope to grow the community's capacity to do good. We seek to address what we see as an antinatalist blind spot in communities that seek to have a positive impact on the world, and we seek to research and develop the contribution antinatalism can make in efforts to do good in the world. We hope that the discussions that will be presented this weekend at our first Antinatalist Advocacy Conference can help to contribute to these aims. So let's move on to the matter at hand. According to Wikipedia, antinatalism is a family of philosophical views that are critical of reproduction. They consider coming into existence as bad or deem procreation as immoral. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a crossroads is a point at which a crucial decision must be made, which will have far-reaching consequences. So why do we feel that this family of philosophical views and the communities that subscribe to them are at a point where crucial decisions must be made? While there are still definitional questions surrounding what antinatalism is, the central and widely accepted idea it posits is that coming into existence is a harm. From this, many questions spring up. Is antinatalism simply about humans not having children, or does it include other sentient beings? Does antinatalism have implications for only our reproductive choices, or are there other actions that we are obligated to take or not take under antinatalism? Should antinatalists pursue voluntary human extinction, or is this misguided? While we at Antinatalist Advocacy can't claim to have indisputable answers to all of these questions, we are, both during and after this conference, hoping to nurture conversations that provide valuable insight into how these questions could be answered. This inaugural Antinatalist Advocacy Conference comes against a backdrop of growing mainstream awareness of antinatalism. More antinatalists are engaging in advocacy, both in person and online, to try and bring their message to a broader audience. Groups like Stop Having Kids and the voluntary human extinction movement have gained mainstream media coverage, including some tweeted warnings from Elon Musk. As well as these events, there have been significant developments in each of the cause areas identified by antinatalist advocacy: human procreation, animal agriculture, wild animal suffering, and artificial sentience. And these developments highlight the urgency of coming to something of a general consensus on the foundational questions of antinatalism so that we can hope to have a positive impact on the world. So what are these significant developments? Last year, the human population surpassed 8 billion people for the first time. Despite the growing social recognition of veganism and animal rights activism, the number of farmed animals being brought into existence and slaughtered annually has continued to grow as the human race on the whole becomes more affluent. Growing concern about the environment has shone a light on the impact of our actions on the extraordinary large numbers of animals living in the wild. And what's more, recent advances in artificial intelligence, have raised the prospect of humans intentionally or unintentionally creating artificial sentience. We believe that antinatalists could have an important role to play in all of these issues. This isn't to say that the target of this conference is solely those who identify with the antinatalist label. People of all viewpoints can be motivated to protect beings from the harms that sentient existence puts us at risk of. And we believe that we should be open to engaging with those who share these motivations. Therefore, we advocate for building of bridges between our small but growing community and other communities where we align on specific issues, rather than seeking to exclude others who may not agree with the entirety of our antinatalist message. In the spirit of this, we would like to extend our gratitude to those who have made this conference possible. First off, the speakers, who have graciously given up their free time to participate. We would also like to thank the moderators for helping us make sure that the conference runs as smoothly as possible, and a huge thank you to the donor who kindly agreed to support the costs of running this conference. Lastly, I'd personally like to thank Lawrence, who's taken on by far the majority of the organising, and I think so far at least has done a grand job. So now let's introduce our speakers. In our first session, we'll be joined by philosopher David Pearce to make the case for genome reform and a biohappiness revolution. Next, we'll hear from activist Seb Alex about why antinatalists should consider the importance of animal rights. We'll then conclude today's conference with a talk from philosopher Matti Hairi about antinatalism and extinction. Tomorrow's session will begin with a talk from philosopher Oscar Horta about contraception and population ethics in welfare biology. We'll then be hosting antinatalist advocates Amanda Sukanik and Ash Wickety and child-free advocate Shweta Ramkumar for a panel on building a healthy antinatalist community. We'll then conclude tomorrow and our conference with an in-conversation session with author Magnus Finding on suffering-focused ethics and how antinatalists can have a positive impact on the world. Finally, before we get to our first talk, we do have a few points of housekeeping to cover. We ask everyone to maintain a civil dialogue in the live chat of this conference, as there will be topics that viewers disagree on. We will be moderating this chat where this cannot be maintained. If you do have any questions for the speakers, please submit them via the form that is pinned in the live chat. Questions posted in the live chat itself will not be included. Please feel free to share the conference. You can use the share button below the stream. And please do tag us on X or Twitter or Instagram if you do so. There is an official hangout after the end of both day 1 and day 2 of the conference, which will be hosted on Discord. The link to join is in the description of the live stream. If you would like to make a donation to support the ongoing efforts of antinatalist advocacy, please send us an email at contact@antinatalistadvocacy.org. These will be very much appreciated. All sessions will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel after the fact, so you can watch everything on catch up. And lastly, this is our very first conference at Antinatalist Advocacy, so there will undoubtedly be lots of room for improvement. We would therefore be very grateful if you could share your thoughts on this weekend by completing our feedback form that will be linked in our newsletter following the end of this conference. That's all the housekeeping out of the way. Just wanted to thank you again for joining the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023, and the first session with David Pearce will now commence shortly.
Okay, welcome everyone to the first session of the Antinatalist Advocacy Conference 2023. So, sorry I wasn't with you in the welcome address, but here I am now. Thanks everyone for joining. The first thing I want to say and get out the way straight away is this is our first time doing it. And I'm sure John has already said this, but because it's our first time, we will be grateful if everyone bears with us for any sort of technical issues or anything that might come up. So I am joined by David Pearce now. So welcome to the first session with David Pearce, and thank you for coming, David. So I'm going to give a quick so I'll just in a second tell you how to submit the audience questions. So it looks like I may be having some internet issues. Hopefully those won't persist. All right. So David will be talking about antinatalism and selection pressure, the case for genome reform and a biohappiness revolution. So David is a philosopher who shares the sort of pessimistic evaluation of sentient life and its predicament with antinatalists, but advocates for a sort of different approach to remedying this problem as we see it. So David is a proponent for transhumanism. David has been prolific in this area. In 1995, he wrote the now famous hedonistic imperative, and he there lays out the case and potential sort of roadmap for the abolition of suffering. So since then, David has given many talks and engagements on the topic, and in 1998 helped set up the World Transhumanist Association, which is now called Humanity Plus. So I think it's safe to say we are in safe hands with David on the topic of transhumanism as an alternative to antinatalism. So a quick one on how to submit questions. So you will, I'm sure, want to be submitting questions to David as he's giving his talk. You can submit questions anytime. All you need to do is go to the description, and there's a link in there to a form, or it's in a pinned message in the live chat. So send your messages in there, and we will get to some of those at the end. So I think that is it. That is, yeah, welcome, David. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, everyone. Yes, I'm a transhumanist. Transhumanists believe in creating a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. And my own focus has been on phasing out the biology of suffering in human and non-human animals and replacing the existing architecture of mind with life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss, reprogramming the biosphere. Now, what has this got to do with antinatalism? Any casual viewer might wonder. Essentially, I should really be starting this discussion, and it really is going to be a discussion because I haven't got a set text or anything like that. Really, to show the nature of Darwinian life, it would really be appropriate to have some extremely gory, ghastly stuff. The statistics. 800,000 people taking their own lives each year, some basically a lot of horror stories, but we're not going to do that. Anything I could conceivably show in the way of gore wouldn't begin to do justice to the horrors of Darwinian life. We are sentient malware, and if there was such a thing as an off button, I would press it. If I thought so-called hard antinatalism, i.e. the idea that everyone everywhere should stop having children and we should somehow use cross-species sterilization or something like that to prevent the suffering of non-human animals, I would be going down that route. Unfortunately, any possible solution to the problem of suffering and the horrors of Darwinian malware, it's not enough for it to be technically feasible. It's also got to be sociologically realistic. And this is the problem with so-called hard antinatalism. Hard antinatalism is just not viable. Most people, for evolutionary reasons, are absolutely determined to have children, and no amount of reasoned argument that antinatalists use is going to change what most people think. Involuntary childlessness, I mean, millions of people worldwide are involuntarily child-free, causes immense suffering. People go to quite extraordinary lengths to reproduce. I mean, now with in vitro fertilization techniques, you get 70-year-olds in India actually deciding to have children. And so I feel that hard antinatalism, extinctionist antinatalism, is a distraction, and that what we really need to do is to build the broadest possible coalition with life lovers to fix the problem of suffering. I mean, a hard antinatalist might say, well, beliefs aren't inherited. That if we present sufficiently powerful, compelling reasons to persuade people not to have children, then we can bring about human extinction via reason, logic, argument. Basically, it's just not going to work. So what should be done? I essentially advocate a version of the abolitionist project. This is the idea that if we are prepared to tweak our genomes, we can create a world without suffering, life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss. And this solution to the problem of suffering doesn't fall victim to selection pressure, because flash forward a few decades, imagine that all prospective parents have the option of choosing essentially the pain thresholds, the hedonic set points, and the hedonic range of their future children. What options are most parents going to choose? I mean, imagine you're a natalist and you can choose basically how happy or sad your child is, what kind of pain threshold your child has. I mean, if you've ever met these rare people who say, oh, pain is just a useful signaling mechanism. We already know the so-called volume knob for pain, the SCN9A gene, and it's got dozens of different alleles. Imagine just picking a benign allele for your kids, so pain is trivialized like this. Something like hedonic set points, it's more complicated, but tweaking even a couple of genes, the far and far out gene, would enable essentially all prospective parents to have kids who are never anxious or depressed, essentially happy. And there is likely to be intensifying selection pressure as the reproductive revolution unfolds in favor of life based on gradients of well-being. Now, it's going to be a monumentally, technically, sociologically challenging process. I think it's realistically only going to unfold over hundreds of years. I mean, it could be sooner. If there are global consensus to fixing the problem of suffering, it could be done in 100 years or less, but there isn't. But over time, there is going to be selection pressure in favor of benign alleles and allelic combinations. And in this, some would say, brave new world, this reproductive revolution, essentially, there will come a time when bringing a child into existence is not immoral, because that child is not going to suffer. Essentially, the child will be living a life based on gradients of intelligent well-being. Now, for evolutionary reasons, such children today are extremely rare. But nonetheless, it's technically feasible to create such kids, and there will be selection pressure in favor of doing so. The abolitionist project, in its broadest sense, goes beyond humans. Within the next few decades, there is going to be a revolution of cultured meat, farm-free animal products, such that it will be possible to get the death factories shut and outlawed together, yes, with moral argument, but I'm very skeptical of any moral argument that actually calls on people to make any kind of personal sacrifice. So, yeah, the horrors of animal agriculture are likely to end this century. Now, naively, the problem of wild animal suffering is completely intractable. But thanks to developments in biotech, it's possible to sketch out how one can have an entirely happy biosphere, that the level of suffering or happiness is going to be an adjustable parameter, and essentially the rest of sentience can be inherently blissful too. Now, naively, that sounds completely ecologically illiterate. How on earth is this possible? But this is the beauty of something like so-called gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. And let's say there is a broad global consensus that we want a living world in which all sentient beings can flourish. It's possible to choose a benign allele or allelic combination that is actually going to lead to a happy, flourishing, free-living organism. Release a few hundred of organisms genetically modified in this way, and essentially all members of the sexually reproducing species in question will inherit these benign alleles, even if they would normally carry a fitness cost to the individuals. So gene drives cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. They're first going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease in Africa, but they can also be used in principle to spread low-pain, happy alleles throughout the living world. And so, something like the problem of predation. Now, I personally think predators are absolutely monstrous. Serial killers, asphyxiating non-humans, absolutely dreadful. But most people, love members of the cat family. They adore them. They're aghast at the thought of a world without lions and tigers. But again, we can reprogram herbivorize predators if it is considered appropriate to do so. And so, yeah, and this question I would ask hard extinction antinatalists. If it were the case that we could phase out the biology of suffering, would you think natalism was inherently immoral? And why are we antinatalists at all? Essentially because, yeah, we know that life breeds suffering. I said, personally, I'm a soft antinatalist. I wouldn't have children, and I would urge anyone else not to not to bring these grotesque genetic experiments into the world. But this isn't a global solution to the problem of suffering. We have to be very hard-headed, realistic. Essentially, one knows so many people who are fanatical life lovers. A lot of my colleagues worry about questions of existential risk, talk of negative utilitarian button pressing, trying to eradicate humans' Darwinian life. It scares them. And if we are serious about fixing the problem of suffering, we are going to need to create the broadest possible coalition of life lovers. Yes, essentially that is the gist of what I wanted to say. I was sorry, what I've said has not corresponded very closely to the slides that Lawrence has kindly been showing. But yeah, really what I wanted to do is essentially open up the discussion amongst antinatalists. Yes, just looking at the slides now. Yeah, I mean, it sounds absolutely crazy, you know, the world's last unpleasant experience. But we do, thanks to genome editing technology, both germline and somatic gene therapy, have the ability to get rid of experience below hedonic zero. It's very, very easy to confuse you know, discussions of what is technically feasible with what is sociologically likely. Is this not just wishful thinking? But one only has to, you know, just ask oneself. Imagine if you really could choose the hedonic range of any sentient being you brought into the world. What hedonic range would you choose? And at the moment, it would be horrifically expensive, technically difficult, but within a few centuries, and more realistically, a few decades, it's going to become, yeah, pretty easy to do something like that. I mean, before something like tackling the problem of wild animal suffering, one would do studies in self-contained artificial biospheres. This spikes a lot of guns if one says, no, we're not going to be experimenting recklessly with nature. We're going to do pilot studies first. And there's this irony in that naively, it's going to be easiest to fix the problem of suffering in humans than domestic non-human animals, and only ultimately, perhaps one day, the problem of, you know, imagine, you know, kind of non-human suffering in Amazonia or deep in marine ecosystems, but synthetic gene drives turn this chronology in its head. In principle, it would be possible to do this back to front. This isn't a prediction. Anyway, yes, okay, thank you. Is reproduction inherently bad, or is reproduction bad insofar as baby making creates involuntary suffering? That's the question I would ask. Yes, I like to invoke the World Health Organization's definition of health, because it's almost surreal. Here you have not so much a transhuman definition of health as a post-human definition of health. And transhumanists argue for an architecture of mind based on information-sensitive gradients of intelligent well-being. But this is the World Health Organization, to which all nations worldwide are signed up, that is committed to a definition of health, complete well-being. I mean, short of something unimaginably technically advanced, not transhuman, but post-human life, we are going to need to preserve information sensitivity, gradients of well-being, to preserve critical insight, social responsibility, intellectual progress. And yeah, so language is important. If you start talking about the language of enhancement, people cry, you know, eugenics, brave new world, it turns people off. But if you talk in terms of the language of health, no sentient being in history has been healthy, as according, by the lights of the WHO definition of health. And the slogan, watchword, good health for all, is potentially saleable in the way that a lot of extravagant transhumanist language isn't. Much more can be said, but I'd like now to take some questions and explore some of the issues with people.
All right, nice one. Well, cheers for that, David, and apologies for the slides not syncing up with everything.
Oh no, my talk wasn't synchronizing with things, is it? You see, I was extemporizing, but yeah, the slides contain the essence of what I wanted to say. If anyone just wants to glance through them, yeah.
Cool. Okay, nice one. All right. Well, just to remind people, if you want to submit questions, then whack them in the form that's in the description and pinned in the live chat on on YouTube. So I've got a few prepared. I say a few, quite a few prepared questions, and then we'll get on to audience questions later. So again, a reminder: submit them in the form, and also just to help us out, please try and make them succinct as well, and to the point. So the first question I actually hadn't written down, but we were talking before we came on air. We were talking about sort of like the transhumanist community in general. And one thing I said that would be interesting to ask you when we're on air is like how you told me that even within the transhumanist world, there are divides on what we should be aiming at. And you were saying that you have this sort of focus on eradicating suffering, but that's not actually the focus for all transhumanists. Are you able to, just for the benefit of people who, this might be some of the people watching, it might be their first time even hearing about transhumanism. Are you able to just give a bit of a description of the landscape of how common actually is it for transhumanists to have the same concerns as you do?
Well, on the bright side, the Transhumanist Declaration of 1998, revised in 2009, includes a commitment to the well-being of all sentients. But there's a great sort of irony in that the World Transhumanist Association was set up by a combination by two people, a button-pressing negative utilitarian and one of whose main focuses is is existential risk, Nick Bostrom. And most transhumanists are fanatical life lovers thinking about existential risk. And the focus of most transhumanists is either super intelligence or super longevity. Super longevity is the idea that just as silicon robots can be upgraded and repaired indefinitely, it's going to be possible to do the same to organic robots and essentially give us effectively quasi-immortal lives, eternal youth. And given that aging undoubtedly causes horrendous suffering, I support research into radical anti-aging and the use of cryonics, even cryothanasia, to defang death. The other of the three supers, super intelligence, super longevity, super happiness, the other big super is super intelligence. This ranges from a different form of extinctionism, which essentially says that our machines are going to replace humans, so-called intelligence explosion, a scenario in which recursively self-improving software-based AI essentially runaway super intelligence, humanity, Darwinian life is going to replace that way. Then there is the Kurzweilian conception of super intelligence, in which effectively humans are going to merge with our machines, something like mind uploading too. There's a third conception of super intelligence, the one I find most sociologically, technically credible, which is the idea that, humans are going to become extinct, but the reason is we are going to edit our genetic source code, and in conjunction with AI, neuroprosthesis, essentially are going to rewrite ourselves out of existence. and talk of, something like a chrysalis becoming a butterfly or something like that, it scares people less than saying that you want humans to become extinct, which I do and our antinatalists do. We just differ in the way this is going to happen.
Yeah, you've already kind of referenced the fact that, let's say that the lay person, and for anyone who, because I know there'll be people watching from all around the world, lay person just means sort of like the average person on the street, when they hear the ideas of transhumanism, and especially to the radical extent of, moving into, altering ecosystems and wild animals, a lot of the people are going to find it, the average people who aren't people like us who think about these things all the time. So we're kind of, it seems normal to us to talk about it. But a lot of people would listen to these ideas and think that they're like crazy. And I think, especially since, a lot of the world is still quite religious, quite conservative, these ideas won't sit well with them. How do you think that transhumanism, and especially, the specific message that you're trying to put forward, how can it have like a PR makeover? Like, what is the best way that it can be presented to the average person and the average politician that will actually mean that it could at some point get widespread public support?
Yes, in terms of PR, if one is trying to sell the message of compassionate ecosystems, often best to start with something like a peaceable kingdom of Isaiah and the lion and the wolf lying down with the lamb. Although it sounds madcap transhumanist stuff, the actual vision of a happy, peaceful living world, it's in the Bible. And I don't know how many people precisely worldwide would call themselves biblical literalists, or at least if asked would say that the Bible is the word of God. But yeah, it's all prophesied in the book of Isaiah. Needless to say, the book of Isaiah was a bit light on the technical details of how this was going to happen. But yeah, that's a good way, I think, to start discussions. And the other thing too, though, people's reactions to wildlife documentaries are quite telling. And unfortunately, a lot of standard wildlife documentaries has got about much relation to the realities of life in nature as some propaganda video or something like that. But nonetheless, when you see on screen, let's say, a baby elephant stuck or dying in a water hole, or some photogenic creature in distress, a lot of viewers protest, write in, why didn't the cameraman intervene? And every cubic meter of the planet is shortly going to be accessible to surveillance, micromanagement, and control. And once one actually establishes the principle of compassionate intervention, asking people, is it right or wrong for the camera crew to intervene to help this struggling, distressed elephant, then one can go on to generalize. Because if you ask people in the abstract, is it right or wrong to intervene in nature? Most people would say it's wrong because it's not natural. But if you focus on specific instances, you'll often get a different response. And there's a different kind of person, people, let's say, high AQ, the systematizers more on the autistic spectrum, who, just going into questions of principles, rules. Do we want a happy biosphere? One can talk about things in a much more generalized way, but focusing on specific examples, I think, resonates more deeply with most people.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think also, a lot of people would reject, human sort of enhancement, if you want to put it that way, along transhumanist lines. But if you offer them the sort of immediate ways that this can actually benefit those that they love or will love, like, for example, being able to reduce the risk of their soon to be born child, their risk of cancer or depression, then I think, that would have much more widespread appeal than if someone just said, let's build a future where, everyone is, a cyborg or something, do you get what I mean? Something like that.
Yes.
So starting at the basic stuff rather than presenting the sort of the end stage of it, as it were. My next question was going to be, and you've kind of referenced a few things that I wanted to include in this. So you've referenced gene editing, but also the future technologies we'll have access to that will, well, if we choose to develop them, that will allow, all-encompassing surveillance, as you just talked about, and things of this kind. Do you think that there is a risk that the very technologies and capacities that we would need to develop to realize a transhumanist future, or the transhumanist future you paint, do you not think there's a risk that those very technologies and capacities could be misused? And, if they fall into the wrong hands, being able to, edit the genes of people, so that you can essentially mold them however you like, to surveil everyone that you would want to, is there not a risk that those could fall, if they do fall into the wrong hands, maybe a government or some sort of terrorist organization, that could be really bad? So would it not be better just to keep them in not developed, essentially? Let's just not bring them about.
I suppose I believe in some form of, sadly, not sadly, scrap the word sadly, in technological determinism, insofar as these technologies are going to come about. And although I've been singing a happy song about how it's going to be possible to reprogram the biosphere, happy, flourishing, sentient beings, yes, there are all manner of ways in which these technologies can be used and abused. The surveillance that could be used to ensure that all sentient beings flourish could also be used in this kind of global panopticon, big brother, totalitarian state. So why cautiously do I think this happy biosphere is going to happen? Essentially because most people, they may be callous, but they're not for the most part malicious. One of the reasons today, for example, that most people would dismiss actively helping non-humans in nature is that it's crazy to talk of doing so while we're systematically hurting and harming and killing billions of sentient beings in factory farms, and how many fish each year. Basically, essentially we are harming non-human animals on a colossal scale. And the idea that humans might actually switch from systematically harming to helping sounds absolutely fanciful. But once it involves zero personal inconvenience, once essentially customers can just pick the cruelty-free options off the supermarket shelves and choose the kind of cruelty-free option in a restaurant. Yeah, most people don't like suffering cruelty. They don't want to think about it. So yeah, obviously it sounds really, really fanciful today, talk of reprogramming the biosphere. But yeah, the technology is going to be there. The costs of doing so are going to collapse. And sequencing the first human genome cost was about $1 billion or something like that. The price has collapsed there. Gene drives, synthetic CRISPR gene drives, their very nature means that the price, obviously there need to be expensive pilot studies, that the actual price for helping hundreds of thousands, even millions of free living species is actually surprisingly cheap. You only need to release a few hundred of the genetically modified organisms for the gene to spread to the entire species. Right now, trying to create a pan-species welfare state or something like that, the cost would be many trillions. It's not realistic, but in an era when factory farms have disappeared and the only remaining large source of involuntary suffering is nature, these are going to be fixable problems.
So one thing that sort of leads on from your answer, you were talking, a lot about how at the moment we are actively harming, the other sentient beings that are on this planet, and many of them being in factory farms, and we sort of, we force them onto this planet and then just sort of abuse them for their whole lives. So both of us are ethical vegans, and so I wanted to ask you, how does having a care for animals, and usually that is coupled with a rejection of their experimentation, how does that fit with pursuing transhumanist technologies? Because I may be wrong here, but I'm assuming that some level of animal experimentation may have to happen to bring these technologies about. Can you comment on that? Like how much would animal experimentation be involved in that? And then does that lead us to be more apprehensive about pursuing it?
Difficult issues. A very large number of experimental procedures don't or needn't involve harm or suffering. The ethically really problematic questions come of procedures that do involve suffering. And though it sounds a bit of a cop-out, I normally say if a procedure would be recognized as wrong if performed on a human, it shouldn't be performed on a non-human of comparable sentience either. And there are a lot of really messy issues here. I said I'm personally ethically a negative utilitarian, but I'm also an ethical utilitarian who believes we should uphold in law the sanctity of life, not because I literally believe in the sanctity of life. I think Darwinian malware is monstrous, but if one doesn't uphold the sanctity of life, the actual consequences will tend to be worse. Sorry for not properly answering your question. Essentially, there isn't an off-the-shelf answer I can give you. Some vegans, as you know, would say absolutely all animal experimentation, non-human animal experimentation is wrong. I would say it's not wrong if suffering is involved. The complication, it's a huge complication, is when suffering is involved.
No, I can understand the wanting to avoid having to pursue anything like that. There's a lot of research that's done, or experimentation that's done on animals, that even if you just remove the ethical side, like it just doesn't need to be done. It's not fruitful at all. And so much of it, even if you're removing the ethical considerations, much of it can be gotten rid of anyway. But it does seem like to pursue these technologies, there will be some level of experimentation that will have to go on, or maybe not. Maybe by the time that we get to this being pursued in a widespread way, maybe we will have alternatives. To be honest, I think this is one of those ethical questions where it doesn't have like a definitive answer, and it's just going to divide people who want to aim at the same thing, but the means of getting there may divide them. So, to be honest, I don't think there is a definitive answer.
All sexual reproduction is a genetic experiment, untested, unplanned, unpredictable consequences. Though one can be fairly confident that whether it's a human or non-human animal, there is going to be a great deal of intense suffering involved in the experiment. So, yeah.
So, another question, I'm going to go to audience questions in a minute, but another question I had was, let's say that, the majority of people watching now, they're like, okay, I loved hearing what David was talking about. I'm fully signed up. I want to help push this forward as well. What are the best ways that just individuals, can help propagate this sort of suffering-focused transhumanism? How can we as individual people, do that? Can we do things on our own? Do we need to organize? Can we be absorbed by existing structures? Do we need to make new structures?
I wish I could report that there was an abolitionist party, society dedicated to this. Unfortunately, there is a leadership vacuum. There is an organizational vacuum. Most transhumanists, as I was reporting earlier, are not really focused on the problem of suffering. Something like effective altruism might seem a natural home, but at least a significant section of the effective altruist community is not comfortable with suffering-focused ethics because they are worried that people will draw, as they would see it, the wrong conclusion, and that the way to end suffering is to end life. And I've said that actually destroying Darwinian life, it's not realistic. We shouldn't go down this route, but there are scenarios, pretty horrific scenarios in some cases, that do make extinction possible. And yeah, the first thing most people will say or respond if you remark that you're a negative utilitarian is something on the lines that, oh, you think we should be destroying, plotting Armageddon or something like that. It's one of the reasons why I prefer to avoid the label. Even suffering-focused ethics, a lot of people switch off. So back to your question, sorry, that number of tangents there. A lot will depend on someone's strengths and backgrounds. If someone feels confident, for example, doing something like, whether it's YouTube Shorts, TikTok, I'm not a professional philosopher. Essentially, I write in a rather clotted academic style. The hedonistic imperative was written notionally for analytic philosophers. The whole landscape has changed, and if you're confident enough to have your own, do your own TikTok videos, YouTube, go down that route. There's been a shift of focus from avowedly transhumans to EA in recent years, funded at least part by FTX. Since FTX exploded and various other factors too, EA has been in the news for all the wrong reasons. It's not clear how well the EA brand is going to endure. Alternatively, I can really respect, there is a very good case for focusing on one particular kind of suffering. And talk, the abolitionist project, let's abolish all suffering, concept, impossibly grandiose, focusing on on animal agriculture. One of the best ways I know that we could radically reduce the burden of suffering in the world is to focus on shutting down slaughterhouses, not telling people they ought to be vegan, but imagine just enacting legislation that kicks in 10, 15 years down the line, with abolish all slaughterhouses. There's this insane poll that's been replicated, I didn't really believe it, that said 47% or so of Americans would be sympathetic to the idea of closing slaughterhouses. I'm not telling them that they're wrong to eat meat, simply these ghastly slaughterhouse owners. That's the weak point in the apparatus of exploitation. So someone, as I said, a pig is as sentient and sapient as, I'm not sure sapient matters, sentient as a pre-linguistic toddler, someone who wants to eventually get involved in animal activism, there is a very strong case for joining one of the organizations there. The shuttle slaughterhouses movement was gaining momentum just before COVID. I think it's the most promising, it's the weak link in the chain. So yeah, by all means, get in touch. In the old days, I used to say, get a website, and I still think there is a great case for someone, who feels to get a website, spread the word. But social media is much more prominent.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thanks for all those suggestions. So I've got an audience question now. So the sort of, if humans were to abolish their own suffering, I'm not sure exactly, and it may be impossible to know, but I'm not sure exactly what the timeframes will be for each of these different stages of eradicating human suffering, then moving on to other animals and wild animals. But if it is that humans are able to eradicate their own suffering first, would this not then cripple or lessen their ability to empathize with other sentient beings who can still suffer, for example, non-human animals? And may this then hinder the wider effort to abolish suffering?
Yeah, good question. But consider there's something like MDMA or ecstasy. It's an empathetic euphoriant. Yes, taking MDMA involves a short-lived euphoria, but also tremendous love and empathy too. So yeah, when we're talking about phasing out suffering in humans, one shouldn't imagine this as turning us into cokeheads. It's more a case of creating life based on gradients of intelligent well-being, and those suffering can make people more empathetic and concerned for non-humans. Too much suffering can often frequently embitter. Too much suffering, rather than creating a sense of moral urgency, leads to a sense of what psychologists call learned helplessness and behavioral despair, creating a world in which all humans go through life animated by gradients of well-being. The happiest people also tend to be the most motivated too. I mean, one of the problems with low mood depression, and a lot of antinatalists have experienced depression or depressed, or loved ones are depressed, is that rather than the sheer urgency of tackling the problem of suffering, it just overwhelms and leads to helplessness. And other things being equal, boosting hedonic set points, hedonic range, leads to a world of active citizens.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't lead us to becoming coked out, because then the transhumanist utopia has already been achieved in London every Saturday night. So the next question was again from the audience. So I was actually watching a video of you the other day, and I think I can't remember how long ago this video was from, so you may have changed your view since then, but I think I heard you express skepticism as to whether artificial sentience will ever be able, in the form of artificial intelligence, this is the conversations going on at the moment, if this is a form of sentience that will ever be able to come about. I don't know what your sort of views are on that at the moment, but the question from the audience is, how can the methods of achieving a transhumanist future that you've been outlining, they seem to rely on like gene editing and things like this. How can we speak about abolishing suffering in potential future digital sentient beings, or just ensuring that if they ever come about, they wouldn't come about with the capacity for suffering? What are your general thoughts on that?
Generally, I'm a super pessimist about most things, but one of the things I don't worry about is digital minds and digital suffering. As far as I can tell, the architecture of classical Turing machines ensures that they can never solve the binding problem, that their ignorance of sentience is architecturally hardwired, that implementations sorry, that box has popped up. I hope it's going to go away. My computer. Yeah, essentially, it's only in a fundamentally quantum world, it's only possible to implement classical Turing machines thanks to decoherence, quantum decoherence. But decoherence ensures that classical Turing machines can never be unified subjects of experience. This is the so-called binding problem, the mystery of, even if you think the hard problem of consciousness can be solved, even if you think, for example, that individual neurons can be conscious, why aren't we so-called micro-experiential zombies? There's 86 billion membrane-bound pixels of experience. And so fancifully, think of a classical Turing machine. Imagine replacing the ones and zeros with discrete pixels of experience. However fast you execute the code and however complex your code, running the code isn't going to create a unified subject of experience. At most, it would be a micro-experiential zombie. And though we see this AI revolution, I've been as bowled over by ChatGPT as everyone else, what we are not doing is creating minds, unified subjects of experience with a pleasure-pain axis. Someone can say, well, how do you know this? Strictly, I don't. But if so-called strong emergence is the case, then essentially the scientific world picture collapses. One can explain exhaustively the behavior of classical digital computers without invoking minds, phenomenally bound consciousness, or anything like that. Now, natural question arises, how is phenomenally bound experience possible in animal minds? I could give you a very speculative account now of why I think we are quantum minds running classical world simulations. But someone needn't buy into these very speculative ideas to accept that essentially our machines are not going to wake up, or at least not so long as their existing architecture is conserved. That it's not incidental, the insentience of classical digital computers, that their inability to solve the binding problem is completely hardwired.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you the last question now, and that is just simply, you've presented your vision. What do you personally want to do with the remaining amount of time you've got on this earth, which obviously is uncertain for all of us? What are your personal aspirations, or the contribution you want to make to this, and what are you working on at the moment?
I wrote The Hedonistic Imperative back in 1995. It was written in this clotted academic style with academic philosophers in mind. I jazzed it up a bit, but essentially, it needs rewriting, updating. F.H. Alstra's Magnus Winding kindly brought out a collection of my essays, but essentially I hope to bring out a book, The Biohappiness Revolution, sometime in the next few years. Jumped the gun rather on Facebook. Someone designed me some nice covers, and a very successful launch of my book covers, but the actual book itself is far from completion. And essentially a crisp synopsis of the abolitionist project, the biohappiness revolution, and essentially for a broad audience of life lovers. Too many people just switch off if you start talking about suffering. The only way to get away with saying just how awful life on earth is for some people is if you can promise them a happy ending.
No, I think that would be amazing, to be honest. And I'm glad to hear you're working on something like that, because there have been a few books that have come out recently that have communicated ideas that a lot of people in philosophical circles are talking about, but they've released a book that is sort of that has more popular appeal. And I think that's really good. So I'm glad to hear you're working on that, and I will definitely be there in Waterstones to get my copy. So thank you so much, David, for coming on and being the first guest on the first ever Antinatalist Advocacy Conference. It's been great to have you and great to listen to your thoughts. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. If you want to stay up to date with David, we will be sending out a newsletter later today with links and everything you need to know in there. So make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. There will be a link in the description. The next session will be happening in around 5 minutes, and that will be John hosting with Seb Alex, talking about the importance of animal rights. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you can see and hear me clearly. For some reason, the lighting situation in my room is pretty poor, but then again, I do live in England, so you should expect. I have 2 lights on currently and the curtains open, but living in England, you don't get much sunlight. Just want to say a big welcome to Seb Alex. Thank you so much for joining us. Seb's going to be talking about the importance of animal rights, especially for antinatalists. But before we get into it, I'll say a few words, if you don't mind, Seb, to introduce you. So Seb is an activist, lecturer, photojournalist, and author. Born and raised in Lebanon, his animal advocacy has taken him to North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. He is a co-founder of the Middle East Vegan Society, a non-profit that promotes plant-based eating and awareness of animal issues in the Middle East and Africa. He's also built a large social media following by sharing his compassionate message with over 100,000 followers on Instagram alone. I think at AA we have about 80, so we're very, very jealous. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Seb, to tackle this important and thorny issue. As before with David Pearce's talk, if you'd like to submit any questions, please do put them in the form, and then I'll try to get through everyone's questions at the end of the session. Yeah, any questions in the chat, please do pop them in the form so we'll make sure that they're filtered through to us. Yeah, that's everything from me. So over to you, Seb.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, I'm just going to prepare my slides. Okay. I'll just try the sharing screen option. That might be easier.
Oh, there you go. Can you see your slides up on screen?
All right, I can see them now, actually. Perfect. Yeah, I don't need to share my screen. All right, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm happy to be here, and thank you everyone who has joined. I just want to mention that I can't see anybody's questions and comments now, but I'm sure we can go through them later on. So if I don't answer anything on the spot, it's because I don't have any access to them straight away. So I'm born and raised in Lebanon. I've been an animal rights activist for around 9 years, and I believe animal rights is a very, very important cause all around the world, regardless of what other causes someone is involved in. Even if they can't commit all their right to animal rights, they should at least make sure that they're not violating the rights of other animals. So today I want to talk about the importance of animal rights from the context of logic and what is the philosophy itself, because with the rise of any movement and any like ideology, let's say, a lot of people join, and with time the core message starts getting diluted. And I really believe that people should know what is the simple philosophy of animal rights. It's not as complicated as some people want to make it sound. So in 1973, the American writer Ursula Le Guin wrote this short philosophical fiction. It's called Those Who Walked Away from Omelas, and it consists of the story of this city called Omelas, where everyone lived beautiful lives. They had everything they needed, and they had festivals, cultural events. They had food all the time. Everyone had shelter, social healthcare, education. Life was great. However, the plot of the story is that for the serenity of the city to continue and that peace and happiness to continue, there should be this one child that is left in a small room facing and experiencing all types of misery and suffering. And once the citizens of the city are old enough, they're taken to that place and they're shown the kid, and they come face to face to what their happiness and tradition and everything they've been doing relies on, which is the suffering of that poor kid. Majority of the citizens, actually all of them of course, get shocked. Majority just go back to the city. They don't do anything about it. But a small fraction of them decide that this is unacceptable and they decide to leave the city. They don't know where they're going, but what they do know is that they will not be coming back, and they are the ones who walk away from Omelas. Now, around 4 or 5 years ago now, actually, I found myself standing in front of the head of a cow inside a slaughterhouse. I was inside documenting what's happening to these animals. And when I went back home where I was staying at the time, there was a dog, and the dog came close to me and started sniffing the blood stains that were on my pants and shoes. And as she was sniffing, I thought how weird it is that the place of this animal is inside our house, is protected by us, cared by us, loved by us. But the place of a cow is inside a slaughterhouse, hanging upside down with her head on the floor. So I have to say that the case of animal rights itself is not that different from the story of those who walk away from Omelas. Neither is how people react to the subject once they learn about it. Some people decide to go back and continue, even if they don't like what they saw, the footage that comes out of the slaughterhouses and the farms. And some people decide to walk away from it. Now, personally, around, I think it's been more than 15 years now, my brother came home one day with this cat that he found on the street, and my parents had this golden rule in the house, which was no animals in the house. And so when he got home with this cat, who was just a few weeks old, we had a massive argument at home, and my mom decided at the end that we can keep the cat, even though we were not supposed to. I was very upset because I thought if we're going to break the golden rule, then might as well get a dog. But at the end of the day, the cat ended up acting more like a dog than a cat, so it was a win-win. So I accepted that, and eventually this cat became like a big part of the family, and many of my friends knew about him as well. He was a very special cat, acted like a dog, as I said, would run to you if you said come, he would sit down if you told him to sit, he would fetch, and any other thing that you can imagine. Eventually, one day, my mom said that she wanted to do an operation. She wanted to declaw the cat because he was destroying all the furniture, the couches. And of course, I was against this. And at the time, I didn't know what to do, but I was arguing with my mom many times, and she wouldn't agree to not do it. So I resorted to the only option that I had, which was launch a Facebook group against my mom and invite all my friends to join the group and share what they thought about my mom's decision. And because we lived in a small flat, I would read the comments out loud. And eventually, my mom decided to not do the operation. And so we claimed victory, and the cat got to keep his nails. Now, at the time, I had a friend who was vegetarian, and she said, "It's really great what you did for your cat, but I really would appreciate it if you stop acting like you're an animal lover." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're not an animal lover. You just love your cat." And obviously, I didn't like hearing that. And so we started arguing, and she said, "How can you claim to be an animal lover if you eat meat, if you eat other animal products, you go hunting every now and then? You're not an animal lover if you're only protecting your cat. You just love your cat, end of story." We continued arguing, and eventually she sent me a video from slaughterhouses called Meet Your Meat, if I'm not mistaken. It was around 10 minutes long, basic slaughterhouse footage from all around the world. And when I finished watching the video, I thought, well, I have to really come up with a good excuse unless I decide to stop eating animals. And she was vegetarian, and I couldn't come up with any excuse, so I became vegetarian. Now, a few years later, I learned about veganism through a documentary called Earthlings, and that documentary was talking about speciesism, which is the next concept or idea that I would like to talk about. So speciesism is often the term that is used to describe the type of double standards that I personally held as well. And although at the time I believed my new stance was a strong one, I have come to the realization now that there's a much more important context here that is not often talked about when it comes to animal rights. And it's the reason why so many people either quit veganism or don't want to identify with veganism or oppose veganism and animal rights altogether. Now, one assumption that justifies this kind of discrimination towards other animals is that they are inferior to or less valuable than humans. However, the position of animal rights is not here to claim that other animals are just as valuable or more valuable than humans. The position is that other animals deserve basic rights. That's it. We're not here to claim which one is more valuable than the other. Now, since harm is being done directly to other animals, the question central to the case of animal rights is about negative rights. And for those of you who don't know, there are two types of rights, positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights are rights such as the right to education, the right to healthcare, and other things. Negative rights are similar to the right not to be harmed, the right not to be exploited or enslaved, or of course, killed. Now, It's also important to mention that having rights is like having an invisible shield that can protect us from being used, exploited, or harmed. They are not a gift or a result of generosity and compassion. They are what we are due. So rights are basically about fairness. Based on what rights are, it's safe to say that if we conclude that other animals deserve negative rights, at least to begin with, then we have to accept that what we are doing to them now directly violates their rights and should be stopped, no matter how much some people might benefit from these rights violations. So we're going to ask ourselves a question that will help us find out if what we are doing to other animals is moral or not, based on our current moral values. And that question is the following: can you name the trait? What is that trait that these other animals have that we don't, that if we were to apply to a human would justify treating the human the same way? So to make it more simple, what is it that these animals have? What trait can each of us think of? And this is why I want to make the case that animal rights is about logical explanation. It's not some weird mental dynamics that we're going to play. It's simply logical extension of what we already believed in, that I want to talk about later on, which is human rights. So what is that one trait that these other animals have that if we were to take from them, like let's say a trait that a pig or a fish or a cow has, we were to take that, copy and paste it onto a human, it would now be morally acceptable to treat these humans the same way. So can we actually think of a trait? Now, it's very simple. I want to go through basic history of philosophy and mention a few philosophers and what they each talked about when it comes to animal rights, because many of them thought that they had found the trait that justifies treating other animals in a different way than the way that we treat each other. So in order to convince people to be open to animal rights and have the conversation, I believe it's easier to treat animal rights as an existing issue that they already agree with. And so that's where the human rights part comes in. When we believe in human rights, we're not claiming that all humans are exactly the same, with the same IQ levels, with the same talents, with the same background of eye color, hair color, whatever. We are basically accepting that we are different when we believe in human rights, but we're also accepting that the differences are not morally relevant differences, right? It doesn't matter how smart I am. It doesn't matter what color my eyes are. It doesn't matter what language someone speaks. In order to decide whether or not this person deserves basic moral rights. So this is the philosophy of human rights. So if we were to show people that by simply extending this logic on animal rights, basically what we're doing to other animals, we would realize that other animals also deserve basic moral rights, these people would be more open to the message because they will not perceive animal rights as a new philosophy that's being introduced. It's literally the application of an existing thought pattern on new victims that we have ignored all this time. So let's start by going through the philosophers one by one, and we're gonna start with the French philosopher René Descartes. So people who followed the philosophy of the French philosopher Descartes have used this argument for decades, and that's the argument that these animals have a specific trait, which is that of lack of communication, right? So they've used this trait to justify treating other animals in a different way. They didn't think that animals were less sentient or conscious than humans. They believed that animals felt nothing. So it's not even the fact that they thought they're not as advanced as us. They thought animals do not feel anything, end of story. And for this reason, they felt that it's completely fine and morally acceptable to nail dogs to boards and vivisect them alive, claiming that since other animals can't use language like English or French to communicate with us, then they surely lack mental life and don't feel anything at all. They're like objects, and since they are like objects, they cannot offer any compelling evidence that they're aware of anything. So this is one trait that someone can give. We're going to go through different traits based on different philosophers and philosophy schools, and we're going to see if it makes sense. So in this case, the trait of lack of communication, if we just simply look at the science, it's important to clarify that most of the animals out there are indeed both conscious and sentient and do communicate, but in their own ways. In fact, the science has been very clear, and it has been a while that it's been clear. In 2012, a prominent international group of cognitive neuroscientists actually gathered at the University of Cambridge and signed the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, where they claimed, and I quote, that the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. Now, when it comes to Darwin, when he was writing of mammalian animals, he observed there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher animals in their mental faculties. The difference in the mental life of human beings and mammals, he added, is one of degree, not of kind. Now, scientific facts put aside, the fact that one may not be able to use language does not suddenly make their nervous system and brain disappear. To accept these ideas is to reject both scientific fact and logic. Now, the next trait that we're going to be talking about is the fact that these other animals don't have any rights. In fact, it's never about rights. It's always about the greatest good for the greatest number. This comes from one of the most influential moral theories that is often talked about, even in the animal rights context, which is utilitarianism, which was founded by Jeremy Bentham. And in fact, it seems to be very convincing at first because it accepts two principles. The first is the principle of equality. Everyone's preferences count, and similar preferences must be counted as having similar weight and importance. The second point is utility. We ought to do the act that brings about the greatest amount of good possible. In other words, utilitarianism holds that the most ethical choice at any time is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. But the weak point of utilitarianism when it comes to moral rights is that in order to figure out what is the most moral action in any situation, we first have to calculate all the pleasure it creates for everyone involved. This involves taking into consideration the pleasure that criminals may get from harming others. So can we genuinely and comfortably count the satisfaction of, for example, a child abuser before deciding to condemn abuse? The very idea of doing so, in my opinion, is an insult to morality. In the same way, can we genuinely and comfortably count the satisfaction we get from eating animal flesh or dairy products before deciding to condemn animal exploitation and killing? Now, when it comes to utilitarianism, it's also important to talk about Peter Singer. The majority of people who talk about animal rights, even if they're not vegans, always refer to Peter Singer as the grandfather of the animal rights movement, but this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, utilitarianism does not and cannot accept any individual rights, so it doesn't make sense for Peter Singer to be the grandfather of a movement called animal rights. And in fact, that will always remain its strongest critique. It is no wonder that even one of the most famous books written on the case of animals, called Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, did not even make Peter Singer himself go vegan, because Peter Singer accepts that animals cannot even accept that animals deserve negative rights, which is why it continues, of course, to shock many people when they find out that he himself is not even vegan. This is why utilitarianism will never be a strong ground to build a case for animal rights. We need a system that considers an act to be immoral because it violates certain moral rights, not a system that waits until we have calculated how much pleasure each individual got while doing the act before deciding if it's the moral thing to do. Now, the next trait that we will be talking about is the fact that other animals have no understanding of rights and morality. So someone can say, well, you're asking what is the trait that these other animals have that we don't, that if we were to apply to us, it would be justified. The trait is the fact that these animals cannot understand what rights are. They cannot understand rules. They cannot understand morality. So this trait specifically was often used by those who followed the moral theory called contractarianism, which has a very clear position regarding morality. Those who frame moral contracts, such as laws, for example, are the ones who matter morally, since other animals are not part of this process, so they can't sit down and have meetings with us and discuss about laws and morality. No matter how much they are like contractors, psychologically speaking, they have no moral standing. The main issue with contractarianism is that it could be used specifically by groups to exploit and discriminate against others. For example, if a higher white class decided to frame the contracts, those belonging to other races, such as marginalized or historically oppressed groups, were not part of this process and were therefore not taken into consideration. And this is obviously a very weak part of the philosophy of contractarianism. Until John Rawls came. John Rawls, who many of you might know already, the famous 20th century political philosopher, had his own solution to the problem of contractarianism that we just mentioned. His idea, which was coined Rawlsian contractarianism, consisted of making the moral contracts behind what he called the veil of ignorance. So we are to make the contracts without knowing what position, background, or class we will have in the society we will live in. One should not know if they are to be, let's say, an athlete or a doctor, a man or a woman, a white person or a black person. So this results in having a set of fair rules, as no one will make a rule that may be in their disadvantage since they're acting behind the veil of ignorance. Otherwise, contractors might risk harming themselves. It all sounds, of course, quite convincing, but when it comes to other animals, John Rawls believed that we only have direct duties towards those who have a sense of justice. And since other animals don't have a sense of justice, he believed that this trait justifies not owing them any rights. Now, he was not the only one who thought this way. In fact, another moral theory that tries to use this trait is Kantianism, from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who believed that all human beings have inherent value and no one should be used as means for an end, which sounds absolutely amazing. He opposed utilitarianism by explaining that just because an action can bring a lot of good does not make it a moral action. So we can talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, where with the help of the US government, hundreds of Black people were used for a study. They were told that they are going to be given medicine, but in fact they were given syphilis, and then they studied all the cases, and they basically made it a medical study without actually the consent of the people who were taken part in it. So of course, under utilitarianism, someone can look into the positive outcomes of that, but under Kantianism, this of course would be completely immoral because you're violating the basic moral rights of the individuals. So although Kant has a very appealing sense of moral justice, he also believed that those who have rights are those who can be held morally responsible. Since other animals have no rights, we can basically use them as means for an end, that end being humans. So we have to really ask ourselves if the trait of lacking a sense of justice, for example, the way contractarianism and Rawlsian contractarianism use in order to justify. We have to think if whether or not you lack this trait suddenly takes away the right for you to have basic moral rights. And very simple example of that can be, for example, human babies or adults with cognitive disabilities. Should they not have any rights since they have no understanding of justice? No human of goodwill would ever suggest that we exploit, use, or kill humans who lack a sense of justice. So if we were to take the trait that is no understanding of basic moral rights or justice, apply it onto a human, would it justify to treat the human the same way? Of course not. So therefore, this argument cannot be the trait that justifies the way that we treat other animals. Although a lot of philosophers try to use it, once we apply it onto a human, it makes absolutely no sense. The next trait that I want to talk about is something that is very often used by a lot of people, especially online, unfortunately, is the fact that other animals have lower IQ levels. Now, I do want to also mention that IQ levels are made to understand the intelligence of human beings. So it's very arrogant of humans to think that the same way, the same test should be ran on other animals in order to justify how intelligent they are. So it's quite a common trait that we hear nowadays, and that makes basically it makes people think that it's justified to not give other animals basic moral rights. It's absolutely ridiculous to claim something like this. If you were to take the trait, which is lower IQ level, apply it onto a human, would you be able to justify exploiting a human, killing a human, and treating them in ways that are harmful just because they're not as smart as you? Of course not. That is unacceptable, and therefore it's a morally irrelevant trait. And if it is the case, then we cannot justify what we're doing to other animals based on the fact that they are not as smart as us. Now, those who possess advanced rational capabilities based on Aristotle enjoy a higher moral status than those who do not. It's absolutely ridiculous, but Aristotle was one of those people who believed that the smarter you are, the more you are entitled to rights. This is why he ended up classifying women as less morally worthy than men, and that those who are deficient when it comes to rational capabilities are born to be the slaves of those who have higher rational capabilities. I hope I don't have to explain why that is not only illogical, but also scientifically completely wrong. Now, when it comes to lower IQ levels, this is not the first time that people have tried to use this trait in order to justify exploitation. And in fact, when there was a big movement against the slave trade industry, there was a French priest called Henry Gregoire. He worked on a book showcasing the artistic and intellectual work of Africans. And he thought, if I can only show the world that these Africans that are being taken slaves are just as smart as us, they're just as talented and can be as intellectual as us, then people would not treat them the way they treat them, right? I just have to show that they don't have a lower IQ level than us. So he sent this letter to Thomas Jefferson, who was also against the slave trade industry. And Thomas Jefferson replied to this letter by saying, whatever be their degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights. Basically saying, like, yeah, it's a great thing that you're doing, but it's irrelevant how smart they are. It's irrelevant how talented they are, because that is not how we should be measuring their rights. Now, the next trait I want to talk about is something that is used often, but it's not a genuine answer. Right? Some people use biological truths such as they are not humans, right? Such truths have no moral importance. All they tell us is that some beings belong to one biological species, while other beings belong to another biological species. But who belongs to what species is not relevant to this question. So when you say it's okay to do this to another animal because they are X being a biological truth about this animal, that's a completely arbitrary thing to say, and therefore has no place in philosophical debates in any way, especially when it comes to morality. Now, moral rights can never justifiably be denied for arbitrary reasons, except if we want to live in a world where factors such as race and gender can be used to deny moral rights of other humans. We can stay here all day and name traits, but not a single one of these traits would hold ground when applied to a hypothetical situation where it is true of a human. At the end of the day, the argument against animal rights remains arbitrary or logically fallacious by appealing to culture, to tradition, or to pleasure. Now, what does this all come down to? You know, do we just give these animals the same rights that we have? Are humans and other animals the same? If we're all the same, are human rights because of the fact that humans? Well, are human rights because of humans being the same? No, of course not. We recognize already that we don't have to be the same in order to have the same human rights. We acknowledge the differences, but we also acknowledge that they are morally irrelevant differences. So similarly, the notion of animal rights is not to say all animals and humans are the same. It's to recognize that there are a lot of differences between us, but also recognize that their differences are morally irrelevant differences, which is why, for example, it does not make any sense to claim, for example, chickens should have the right to drive a car, or a cow should have the right to vote, because these rights are completely irrelevant to these animals. We need to give them rights that are in their own benefit. And I'm mentioning that because, unfortunately, it's very common for people to say, well, what does this mean? You know, you're going to give these animals the same rights that humans have. It's not about that. It's about giving them what they actually deserve. So in his book, Justice, which is written by the American philosopher Michael Sandel, while talking about the case of the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens, he raised the question in defense of a weak orphan boy who was killed and eaten by two adults while all three were stuck and starving on a small boat for 24 days with no one to rescue in sight. He wrote in the book, even if all things considered, the benefits do outweigh the costs, don't we have a nagging sense that killing and eating a defenseless cabin boy is wrong for reasons that go beyond the calculation of social costs and benefits? Isn't it wrong to use a human being in this way, exploiting his vulnerability, taking his life without his consent, even if doing so benefits others? So to make it clearer, there was a shipwreck, a few people survived, and there was an orphan boy with them. And after 24 days, out of desperation and hunger, they decided to kill and eat the boy in order to survive. Now, the interesting thing is that when they were saved, they actually told the people what they did, thinking that people would understand and say, oh yeah, it makes sense that you did that. But of course, they were actually charged with murder. Now, what I want to do is I just want to ask, what would happen if we were to replace the cabin boy with any other animal, right? Can we find a reasonable way to answer the same question that Michael Sandel raised? Even if all things considered, the benefits do outweigh the cost, don't we have a nagging sense that killing and eating a defenseless animal is wrong for reasons that go beyond the calculation of social costs and benefits? Isn't it wrong to use another animal in this way, exploiting their vulnerability, taking their life without their consent, even if doing so benefits others? Now, someone can say, well, I have an objection, and that's that there's a very big difference between these two examples, but the only difference that I personally see is the fact that the two adults were starving to death and had no other options, whereas the majority of human population is not exploiting and killing other animals out of necessity. And even in the situation where they were starving, they were still found guilty of murder. So, brings us back to our question. Can you name the trait that is true of other animals that, if true of another human, would justify treating the human the same way? If you believe that there's any moral difference between these two cases, I invite you to name the trait that introduces these differences. Until you find one, I would like to ask you all who, unlike the people of Omelas, the book that we talked about in the beginning, who, unlike them, do not depend on exploiting other animals to live safe, happy, healthy, and blissful lives. If you know that for your meal, a cow was slaughtered against her will, a calf was taken away from her mother, a male chick was thrown in a macerator for being useless in the egg industry, a pig was put in a gas chamber before slaughter to be sold as humanely killed, if we know that there is a massacre of around 84,000 animals per second, can we comfortably let others continue doing what they do? Or should we get them to go, let's say, vegan and stop contributing to the suffering of other animals, the way the people of Omelas stopped contributing to the suffering of the child? Or in fact, should we get them to do what the people of Omelas should have done, which was go back to the city, inform people about the suffering kid, and bring justice to the individual whose rights are being violated? If vegans were responsible for 0.1% of the damage and destruction of the animal agriculture industry, we'd be classified as domestic terrorists and thrown in jails. Yet we are being accused of being that for simply documenting the crimes that are taking place inside this industry. I would like to ask you all to always try your best to make sure that people not only agree with animal rights, but also feel the responsibility to take action in any way possible to join this movement. So if you are not vegan yourself, please ask yourself why you haven't been applying this logical extension of human rights onto other animals. This is the least that other animals deserve, in my opinion. Now, I want to finish today's talk with a beautiful poem written by Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, who lived almost 1,000 years ago, a Syrian poet who also happened to be an antinatalist. And he was a vegan. He was blind from the age of 4. And 1,000 years ago, he was not only vegan, but debating animal rights back and forth with other intellectuals, philosophers, and poets. The poem is I No Longer Steal from Nature. And it says, you are diseased in understanding and religion. Come to me that you may hear something of sound truth. Do not unjustly eat fish the water has given up, and do not desire as food the flesh of slaughtered animals, or the white milk of mothers who intended its pure draught for their young, not noble ladies. And do not grieve the unsuspecting birds by taking eggs, for injustice is the worst of crimes. And spare the honey which the bees get industriously from the flowers of fragrance plants. For they did not store it that it might belong to others, nor did they gather it for bounty and gifts. I wash my hands of all this and wish that I perceived my way before my hair went gray. Abu Ala al-Ma'ari's tombstone said, this crime done to me by my father was done to no one. And that was his stance when it comes to antinatalism as well. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. And I think we can start taking questions now.
Great. Thank you so much, Seb. A really amazing quote there by Al-Mari, as you were saying, from 1,000 years ago, a vegan and antinatalist. He's my go-to example when people say that this is all just some modern thing that you're doing, that
Yes.
these millennials have invented this or whatever. I always point to that 1,000-year-old poem. So just going through the questions now. So if everyone was to take your advice and go vegan, it does appear that there would be our actions would have antinatalist consequences on animals. We wouldn't be bringing these farm animals into existence. So to what extent do you separate antinatalism and veganism, firstly in your advocacy, but also in terms of how you understand the philosophies?
That's a good question. When it comes to my advocacy, I'm very careful of when I bring which topic, right? I'm firstly an animal rights activist, and my stance on antinatalism came to me after becoming an animal rights activist. My main worry is, of course, the incredible amount of harm that we're causing onto other animals. And by becoming an animal rights activist and a vegan, of course, you're taking away all of that contribution that you have already, which, you know, as antinatalists, we believe in what we believe because we understand what suffering means, and we want to stop that type of suffering. So for me, it's not even a question that the first step should be to go vegan if you believe in antinatalism. Why else would you want to make sure that there's not like so much suffering in the world? So I definitely think that there's a direct link between the two, but the link is more of a strong link of, if you believe in antinatalism, you have no other option. You have no justifiable way of continuing to consume animal products. The other way around, I think, if I imagine myself to have been an antinatalist first and then come across animal rights, I think that would again be an extension of my it's like a logical extension of what I already believe in, right? So I think, yeah, in my specific case, personally, I was like first an animal rights activist, then came across antinatalism. But I think the other way is also a very simple and easy like extension of what you already believe in. Do I separate the two philosophies in my advocacy? Yes, I do. I've found, you know, when you talk about animal rights, it's already such a triggering topic for majority of people.
Yeah,
I think because of the fact that that they take part in it, right? If you talk about animal rights, but you talk about bullfighting, everyone would be like, yeah, very bad, because most of the people don't take part in bullfighting. So it's easy to stand up against something that you're not contributing to. I found that case to be even worse with antinatalism. And I think the reason for that is because, unlike bullfighting or eating animals, giving birth is a natural thing. If anything, we can make the case that it is the main reason that we are alive, to pass on our genes, right? So it's even more triggering because of the fact that it's a natural thing. But of course, I mean, I'm not saying therefore it's good, because then I'm just appealing to nature, which is a logical fallacy. But no one can say that it's natural for us to what we're doing to other animals, because it's not. But someone can try to defend their stance of being pro-natalism by saying, well, this is how we are as human beings, this is what we do, right? So I found the reaction to be much stronger to antinatalism.
Yeah.
My fear is usually, if I link both together in my advocacy, is to completely lose the person. And when I do that, then they're not going to listen to animal rights. And the result of that is also that hundreds, if not thousands of animals are going to be killed throughout this person's life because they didn't take their time to listen to me, because the topic of antinatalism completely put them off.
Yeah.
So I'm very careful in the steps that lead towards antinatalism. To give a very simple example, last weekend I gave a lecture, and afterwards there was a journalist who asked me a few questions about animal rights, and eventually the topic went into antinatalism, which she wasn't even aware of. She didn't even know something of the sort existed, but I felt comfortable to talk about it because it was like quite a gradual way the conversation evolved. So then I felt safe, and she was actually very interested. So I think it's unfortunately a difficult conversation mixed with an already quite emotionally charged conversation.
Definitely. I think people generally, when you talk to them about animal rights, they have an inkling that something is wrong. Whereas when you talk to them for the first time about antinatalism, it's easier to dismiss you as a crank or a weirdo. And then sadly use that to dismiss your position on animal rights as well, exactly, which they were probably closer to getting. And we've got a question here about whether or not you are categorically opposed to moral agents breeding non-human animals. Like, is it, we talked about eating animals, like killing the animals as being categorically wrong. Does the breeding of animals, is that also categorically wrong in your opinion?
Yeah, because humans should have no right to bring into existence even another animal. Who are we to bring another animal into existence? The only reason why we do that is for human gains. We never do it in order to please the other animal that we're bringing into existence. Take from puppy breeding to breeding of farm animals to breeding horses. It blows my mind that these industries even exist, to create other animals into existence for human profit. Basically, I am, yes, opposed to that.
Yeah. And I do have a technical philosophical point. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're talking about negative obligations not to infringe with animals when it comes to animal rights. With respect to wild animals, when animals are breeding in the wild, and then those animals will, eat each other alive, or animals will die of disease and this kind of thing, do we have any positive obligations to stop those animals from breeding to protect their offspring who will tend to go on to live unfortunately pretty bad lives?
So my personal stance is, usually the way I say it in the talk is these animals deserve negative rights to begin with, right? Because I also believe that we should get to positive rights. For example, if I would like to start with negative rights and then end up with positive rights because of the fact, if I'm on the street and this has happened, I see a suffering dog, I believe that that dog has the right that I take them or any other human takes them and sees what's happening to them and takes care of them and everything, if they have means, of course. And do I think that we should do the same with wild animals? Yes. The only reason I don't talk about wild animals specifically, to be very, very honest, is because I cannot even imagine what type of intervention we can even create to start targeting the case of wild animals. And this is a topic that I discuss a lot with a few friends of mine who are more educated, let's say, when it comes to wild animal suffering, because I always think, what could we even come up with, and where do you draw the line, right? Because some people even count, they say, no, they say it's even more important than farmed animals because their numbers are so much bigger, and that's because they're counting ants and worms and underground creatures. And that's where I kind of struggle to completely agree, because I feel like as much as it's about individual suffering, there's also, in my opinion, a certain level of sentience that we should consider looking into, how much a cow suffers in a dairy farm versus how much a worm suffers underground, and how much I can do to stop the suffering of a cow versus how much I can do to stop the suffering of a worm underground. So the discussion that I usually have with my friends is whether or not we could ever come up with a solution for wild animal suffering. Whereas for farmed animals and animals that we're exploiting, we have the solution. It's there, right? We just have to implement it. So one of my friends said, well, we should concentrate on raising awareness about it so that if one day artificial intelligence helps us to find a solution, then people would agree. And yeah, I agreed with that, definitely.
Great. And as David Pearce was saying in the first talk, if we can't get people to care about, you know, the cow that's in their beef burger, I don't know how we're going to get them to care about the worm under the ground. Like,
yes.
It's like, yeah, this one's so in front of your face, you know, it's a lot easier to grasp. And on the topic of wild animal suffering, actually, there's just a question from the audience about whether or not it would be immoral for humans to go extinct and allow wild animals to inherit the earth, given that there is a lot of wild animal suffering out there.
I like these questions. That's a good one. Is it immoral for humans to go extinct, given the fact that we will leave behind a lot of wild animal suffering? So that the question, I think it's a difficult question because it kind of already carries creates a fact that if we were not to go extinct, we would definitely find a solution to wild animal suffering. So the is creating the idea that we would find, right? Whereas I'm very skeptical of whether or not we would. And so then my personal answer there would be, well, when do wild animals suffer more with us on the planet or not on the planet? I would think we create more wild animal suffering by existing on this planet. Actually, not wild animal suffering, but overall animal suffering by existing on the planet than by not existing on this planet. Because if we're not on the planet, then there are tens of billions of animals that are not being, basically bred into existence. So we're taking all of that away, which, at least when it comes to mammalian animals, is I think wild animals, someone can correct me, I believe they're less than 5% or 10% of animal population. So maybe even 4% is the number I remember, but anyone can correct me in the comments, of course. So I do think that there will be less overall suffering without humans existing because of the fact that we wouldn't be breeding all these animals into existence, which put the numbers together are much higher than the number of wild animals.
Interesting. Well, just on the topic of wild animal suffering, we do have our talk with Oscar Horta. I'll quickly plug that. But one of the big causes of extinction in wild animals at the moment is, of course, animal agriculture.
Yes.
And I do use that as a counterexample to people who say that humans are having a positive impact on the world by reducing the amount of wild animal suffering. But if they're replacing rainforests with factory farms and, you know, like intensively farmed fish, which is just a huge number of beings, I'm not so sure this is a positive impact. Just going through these audience questions. Oh, an interesting one about rights. So as you were saying in the talk, there's not a morally relevant trait between humans and other animals. Does this mean that they are therefore equally morally valuable?
I've thought about this many times because I like to ask myself hypothetical questions to see where I have difficulties in answering questions or hypothetical questions simply. So I ask myself, like, for example, if I'm driving down the road and I have to in this hypothetical situation hit, let's say, I don't know, I'm not going to say a dog because everyone's so emotionally charged with dogs, but like, let's think about any other animal.
A deer. It happens quite a lot in the UK. People might run over.
Let's say a raccoon.
Okay, a raccoon.
Deers are so cute.
No, Bambi. I didn't think about that. Bambi is people.
Exactly. So if I were to choose between a raccoon and a human, and let's imagine that I would not face any legal consequences if I were to hit a human. Let's imagine, for the sake of the hypothetical situation, which one would I feel worse about? To be very honest, I personally would feel worse about the human. And again, to be very honest, I don't know why. I do believe that each species, like of animals, we're kind of wired to feel more empathy towards our own species, because I could sit down and come up with explanations why I shouldn't feel worse for the human. Like I could say that human could be this, that human could be that, like, oh, overall suffering is reduced because of what happened, the accident, but still, for some reason, I would feel worse. And that reason could just be societal conditioning, right? But I don't know what it is. So I struggle to claim which species has more relevance or value than the other. I just know what I would feel in specific situations. On the other hand, someone can say, if you were to save your 3 dogs from being thrown, I don't know, down a building or something, or let's say a much more quick death, versus a stranger human, right? I would save my dogs, and because there is an emotional connection. So it's a very difficult question, and I can see myself choosing different species depending on the hypothetical situation, and in each specific example, my justification is going to be a different one. So if anyone can come up with a better answer than that, I'm more than happy to listen.
It's a tough one. It's one I've thought about as well, and I do think that fortunately for the issue at hand today, like the main issue with respect to veganism and antinatalism, which is breeding these animals into existence, we're not forced to choose the either or. But I always get caught in a situation where it's like, well, if you were on a boat and there was that cabin boy we talked about earlier, or a pig, which one would you eat? And I always think, well, when I'm in that situation, I'll let you know next time I'm candidacy. We've got a few minutes before we wrap up. I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Middle East Vegan Society and in general, your community building in the Middle East. Firstly, how's it going? And also, are there any lessons that you could have for like building a healthy antinatalist community from your experience of community building?
Well, if the antinatalist community is anything like the vegan community, good luck. No, I think it's always difficult, because, and I have a good explanation of why it's difficult. Before I get to Middle East Vegan Society and the work that we're doing there, I think it's very common to see infighting and what people refer to as drama or problems or people falling apart in the animal rights movement. The reason for that is because people assume that just because they have this thing in common, that they would get along. That is as ridiculous to assume that because I and another person on the street believe in human rights, then we would get along.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. Of course, you're not going to get along with everyone. That's a given. It blows my mind that people think that it should be like, oh, that person is a vegan, of course we're going to get along. It makes no sense. So I think personally the key factor of creating a healthy community is communication. If you don't have healthy communication, because you're going to have people disagreeing on things regardless of what community you're in. But if you don't know how to communicate, then forget about having a healthy community. You have to be open to communicating about things. Just yesterday morning, someone reached out to me on behalf of someone else who was at one of my lectures and took a very big stance about something specific I shared, unrelated to animal rights. And she genuinely reached out to that person to reach out to me to ask if I'm open to discuss the topic privately, not even like publicly. And now we're sending each other voice messages discussing the topic. And why, like, that just shows like you can make drama out of an issue, or you can just communicate in a healthy manner. I doubt this person and I are ever going to be on the same. Maybe we will be. I don't know, but I doubt it because of like very specific things I don't want to get into.
Yeah.
But the fact that she took that step to have healthy communication with me, I thanked her for doing that. She thanked me for taking the time as well. So that helps a lot. When it comes to Middle East Vegan Society, it's going great. I do want to specifically clarify one thing. I helped co-found the Animal Rights Center in Lebanon. And that's unrelated to Middle East Vegan Society. So I helped co-found that, and then I founded the Middle East Vegan Society. And I want to mention that because I don't want to take credits for the Animal Rights Center in Lebanon. That was mainly the work of Lebanese vegans. I was just trying to help out in founding it. The Middle East Vegan Society's work is going great. I'm born and raised in Lebanon, and I knew that this is one area of the world that is completely neglected when it comes to animal rights. We are technically the only organization, animal rights and vegan organization, that is doing the type of work that we're doing. There are a lot of grassroots groups, by the way. We're not the only ones. So I want to make that clear. There are grassroots groups such as Lebanese vegans, Jordanian vegans, Palestinian vegans, Egyptian vegans in Morocco, so many places, Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, there are vegans. In Iraq, you can check out on Instagram, there's an Iraqi vegan antinatalist page, right? So vegans and animal rights activists are all over the Middle East and North Africa, but it's a very neglected region. And we wanted to basically put the activists and the work that they're doing and the movement in general on like our pages and give it a platform, because of the fact that more Western-based organizations and vegan news platforms have been ignoring and neglecting this specifically. So we wanted to address that problem and also create content on animal rights and veganism in Arabic, which is one of the top 5 most spoken languages in the world. And so we're working on a project with that. We are very soon, in the next 2 weeks, launching our Vegan Islam initiative, which is a project that has been developed by, I was not involved in the research since I'm not a Muslim myself, but it was developed by ethical animal rights activists who are also religious Muslims. And so some of them are vegan because of the scripture and the religion. Very convinced by it. So they put together this initiative that shows that not only can you be a vegan as a Muslim, but the scripture actually would encourage you to speak out speak up for animal rights. So that's going to create a lot of noise, I'm sure, when it comes out. But it's not interpretation or anything. It's like factual information about the scripture that is out there. So very excited for that as well. It will be launched both in Arabic and English as well. And we already have many organizations worldwide who have asked us to translate it to other languages. And we have a bunch of projects for next year as well, but taking it one thing at a time.
No, definitely. That's a good bit of advice about not biting off more than you can chew. But thank you so much, Seb. As we mentioned before, we're going to be sending around our newsletter after this with links to all of Seb's work. So please do check those out. And we'll be back in a few minutes' time for a talk with Matti Hyrie about antinatalism and extinction.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so welcome to the next session. So hopefully everyone was able to get a bit of a break, because I know there was only a couple of minutes there. But welcome to the next session. So this one is with Matti Hairi. So this session is the last one for today, and Matti is going to be talking about antinatalism and extinction. But before we actually get on to the talk, I'm going to give a bit of an intro. But remember, if you have questions for Matti throughout the talk, then send them into the form, and we will get to them near the end. So Matti is a philosopher, and he's been a should we say a beacon of antinatalism in academia in Finland. The the person who first sort of formalized the risk argument for antinatalism in his 2004 paper, A Rational Cure for Pre-Reproductive Stress Syndrome. So Matti most recently has been involved in publications such as Antinatalism Solving Everything Everywhere All at Once, and Imposing a Lifestyle, a New Argument for Antinatalism, and is actually the co-author for an upcoming book called Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. So I'm really looking forward to this one, not least because I think I'm going to be getting called out for some of the things I've been saying. So that would be interesting to see. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I hope everyone is too. I'm sure everyone is too. And a reminder, if you want to ask a question, pinned message in the chat and the description, there's a form there, send them in, and we will try and get to as many as possible near the end. So I think yeah, it's over to you, Matti.
Thank you, Lawrence, for that nice introduction. I'm also a co-host of a podcast with Amanda, Falling into the Antinatal Abyss. But that's enough about me for now. Let's just roll the presentation.
Okay, great. Okay, it doesn't look like that is working. Let me try again. Let me just figure this out. Apologies, everyone, for the delay. Okay, for some reason that is not working. Let me just quickly try again. Okay, cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get it to run a different way. So give me 30 seconds. And it will be with us very shortly. Okay.
Very good to build this excitement and the suspense.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Like I said at the start, there are going to be some technical hiccups. So, okay, cool. All right, I think I've got it going. All right, so let's go.
Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Just give us 2 minutes and we'll be back. Okay, right. I think we have everything figured out. So hopefully everything will play. So the next thing you should see is Matty's presentation. Apologies for the technical hiccups. It's going to happen. It's the first time we're doing it. But the next thing you should see will be Matty's presentation.
And here we go. That's the title of my presentation. That's my academic affiliation, and that's my antinatalist t-shirt collection. My name is Matti Häyry, and I am an antinatalist philosopher, or at least I think I am. My antinatalism to me means that I don't have children that I know of. I don't intend to have children, and I'd be pleased to see everybody acting like me in this respect. Being a philosopher to me means that I'm not an activist, and my primary aim is not to advocate antinatalism, although my explications of antinatalist views may convince some others of their force. Pretty clear sailing so far, I'd say. But wait, there's more. I'm also an extinctionist philosopher, or at least I think I am. My extinctionism to me means that I'm not alarmed by the idea of not having existed in the first place. I'm not alarmed by the idea of not existing anymore, provided that my existence ends nicely, easily, and in my control, and provided that its ending doesn't unduly hurt or inconvenience those that I'm responsible for. And I would be pleased to see everybody thinking like me in this respect. Being a philosopher to me means here the same as it did in the case of antinatalism, that I'm not an activist and my primary aim is not to advocate extinctionism, although my explications of extinctionist views may convince some others of their force. I am then an extinctionist antinatalist philosopher, and I have been approximately this way for almost as long as I can remember. And I have thought that this combination of extinctionism and antinatalism is self-evident, that everybody else in our circles thinks like me. Imagine my surprise then when all of a sudden I encountered this statement by one of the organizers of this fine conference, the illustrious Lawrence Anton.
Should the extinction of humans be the or a goal of an anti-procreative movement? And if so, why? So my view on that is that I don't think it's necessary to have it as a goal. I think an anti-procreative movement should be what it says on the tin. It's anti-procreation rather than pro-extinction. Even though being anti-procreation will very likely practically lead to extinction, I think there's an important difference between being anti-procreative and pro-extinction.
And just like that, he contradicted everything I had ever believed in. The extinctionist antinatalist in me was crushed, but only for the briefest of moments. The philosopher in me came to the rescue and explained that while Lawrence has an obvious point, there are still grounds for believing that the connection, at least in an ethical sense, is quite strong. This presentation is an attempt to clarify my take on the matter. I'm starting with the observation that obviously antinatalism is not the same as extinctionism. They are two different things. And perhaps no one claims that they are the same thing. It's more likely that the claim is normative. If you accept one, you should also accept the other. Lawrence actually makes something like this distinction by saying, even though being anti-procreation will very likely practically lead to extinction, I think there's an important difference between being anti-procreative and pro-extinction. His focus seems to be on what to promote or advocate. That is up for the conference. I'll return to this as soon as I've sorted out why I have thought what I have thought. Since it's always easier to see the mistakes others make than the mistakes one makes oneself, I might just as well start with an example. Recently, a colleague of mine, Joona Räsänen, argued in a collection that we edited together that ethical vegans must also be antinatalists. Without further specifications, I think that this is obviously wrong. I could be a vegan because I believe that humans should not use non-humans just as a means to their own human ends. And I could be an antinatalist because I believe that giving birth to children endangers women's health and well-being. Both convictions are ethical, but they are different. I can hold one without holding the other. Joona's point, however, was that an ethical vegan has to be, by his definition, a negative utilitarian. Negative utilitarians, as you all probably know, maintain that we should not by our actions increase pain or anguish in the world. Food production increases pain and anguish among non-human animals, and veganism is therefore the right choice. But bringing more sentient beings into existence also increases pain and anguish in the world. That had they not been in the first place, the suffering they encounter would not have occurred. It would be better then not to have them, and antinatalism is also the right choice, and for the same reason, veganism is right. The conclusion here is, of course, more limited than the one originally suggested. It is, those who are vegans on negative utilitarian grounds should probably also be antinatalists on negative utilitarian grounds. Why am I bringing this up? Well, the case reminds me of my own theoretical origins. See, during the last 2 millennia, my thinking has evolved in these steps. Utilitarianism, the traditional version. Measure the good and the bad outcomes of your action alternatives and choose the one that on balance maximizes the net good or minimizes the net bad. Negative utilitarianism. Forget about the good and concentrate on the bad. Don't choose an actional alternative that promotes suffering. Extinctionism. Admit that as long as there are sufferers, there is suffering. Remove sentient beings from the equation and stop the suffering. Antinatalism. Realize that all other ways of removing sentient beings from the equation will probably just promote more suffering, and that the kindest way to proceed is to stop reproduction. These steps in my thinking are partly, but only partly, well documented. Utilitarianism. Yes, clearly in my 1994 book, Liberal Utilitarianism and Applied Ethics. I flirted with negative utilitarianism, but the idea of human extinction was so unpopular that I retreated to a more traditional version. Negative utilitarianism, yes, but in its full form only earlier this year in my article Exit Duty Generator. It was budding already in my 1995 paper, Is it undesirable that children are born infected with HIV? But that was published only in Italian years later and went unnoticed. Extinctionism. Yes and no. I know the exact date in November 1998 when, talking about the human predicament and the big red button with my then partner in Cowbridge, Wales, I realized that I am a voluntary human extinctionist. I must have preached a good message to everybody after that because, although I never properly publicized the view, many academic friends are on record during the noughties criticizing the hell out of my newly found inhumanity. Antinatalism. Yes, but sort of unbeknownst to me for a long time. In 2004, I published a short article titled A Rational Cure for Pre-Reproductive Stress Syndrome. I argued that having children is irrational and immoral. It took 12 years, however, before I found out that I had, in that paper, presented what some call the original formulation of the risk argument for antinatalism. Oh well. And finally, I get to the point of this lengthy exposition of my personal intellectual history. I was an extinctionist first, and antinatalism for me has, up to this day, been just a gentle route towards the voluntary demise of humankind. Hence my surprise when I saw Lawrence's declaration. But to summarize, he is spot on. Antinatalism and extinctionism are two different beasts, held together in my head only by the negative utilitarian ethos underlying both. Taking on board my own criticism of Jonas' insistence that vegans have to be antinatalists, I must admit that there are different reasons for being one or the other, also in the case of extinctionism and antinatalism. Amanda Sukenik and I listed some of the motives behind people's aversion to having children in our forthcoming book, Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. The list is partly jocular, but Amanda assures me that this is the landscape we must enter if any dream of antinatalist advocacy is to come true. This is what we came up with.
Population growth degrades the natural environment. The world is a bad place and should not be populated more. Reproduction requires sex, and sex is a sin. Our children's lives would be bad. We do not have their permission to bring them into existence. Life is suffering, and we should not contribute to its continuation. Children are a burden. Children are a nuisance. Men are evil. Women are evil. Human beings are evil. Humankind inflicts suffering on other species. My life sucks. I wish I were dead. I wish I had never been born. My life has no meaning. Human life has no meaning. Life has no meaning.
The list can go on. It is, to say the least, a mixed bag. You may agree or disagree, or maybe your pet reason is not included, but one thing is clear. Most of these are real-life motivations for being an antinatalist, and not all of them have anything to do with extinction. Extinction of some kind is, however, an inevitable consequence of consistent antinatalism. If no one has children anymore, humankind will meet its demise within a century or so. If that sounds too sudden, there are alternatives, of course. If every reproductive couple only has one child, and if they all have the one child in their early 30s, we get from the current 8 billion human beings to zero in about 33 generations, or 1100 years. Some people, notably David Pearce, who is with us today, say that humankind will never assume reproductive policies like these. Therefore, they continue, we should aim to reduce suffering and to increase happiness by other methods, technology, medicine, genetics, and the like. If all suffering could indeed be eliminated by technological means, negative utilitarians should have no ethical complaints. I have a conceptual complaint, though. If humankind continues to reproduce without a time limit, in what sense are we talking about antinatalism here? David Pearce has called himself a soft antinatalist because he has no children and no wish to have them. He can, of course, use that name as long as we keep one thing in mind. It is that his personal choice has no necessary connection with his views on technology and the hedonistic imperative exquisite creations that they are. Negative utilitarianism or utilitarianism more generally could dictate both, but living happily ever after is not antinatalism. Nor is voluntary childlessness without a universal dimension like my I'd be pleased to see everybody acting like me. It's just what it says, or should say, on the tin. Voluntary childlessness. Admirable, but no immediate antinatalist cigar that I can see. Vocabulary aside, however, the very real question raised here is more general. Is it at all realistic to think that humankind would ever stop reproducing? Is all this just chasing shadows? Two answers offer themselves, a historical one and a normative one. What I say here is based on my investigations and analyses with Amanda Sukenik for our publications. The historical response is that it's early days yet. Human beings want to have sex, and sex has been inexorably linked with reproduction throughout history. The link is gradually breaking, at least in the global north. Contraception and reproductive autonomy are already at work. I know that most of you, most of us, want the change to happen now, or preferably yesterday. But if that's not realistic, maybe the acceptance of a slower pace would be advisable. Continue knowing the foundations of pronatalism in the sure and certain hope of better times ahead, maybe. Normative response is to turn inwards a little, away from the world-embracing concerns of utilitarianism and related consequentialist views. I can at least retain my own purity in this matter and let other people know about my reasons. Perhaps some of them will follow suit. And whatever others do, I'm not chasing shadows here. My decision not to reproduce prevents the coming to existence of at least one line of sufferers. Good for me, good for them. There. It has been demonstrated that some humans can stop having offspring. Not enough, but it's a start. All this has been explained in more detail in Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption, which will be available soon online, open access. When that one inevitably goes viral and the airport sales of the hard copies start producing millions and millions, Amanda and I should perhaps start a pension fund for antinatalists. Isn't that what concerns the pronatalists? Who will look after them in their old age? We'd have our own solution here. But I stray. This was supposed to be about extinction. What was my point? Well, an interim conclusion and a three-pronged corollary. Antinatalism proper, consistent antinatalism, leads to voluntary human extinction. If negative utilitarianism or something similar is evoked, other varieties of extinction can come to play. If a sentiocentric theory of value is used, maybe all sentient life should be wiped out in the name of eliminating suffering. If a reversely biocentric theory of value is used, maybe all life should be wiped out, perhaps because life finds a way to become sentient. And if the analysis is not confined to carbon-based life, maybe machine sentience, self-awareness, and so on should not be developed. Analyzing concepts and theories I have assumed so far doesn't necessarily mean advocating the related views. But this is a fine line. Let me explain what I mean. You may be surprised to hear this, but Amanda and I wrote our forthcoming book under constraint. Our supervising production editor at Cambridge University Press made it clear to us in no uncertain terms that there is to be no advocacy of antinatalism in the text. Now, this is highly unusual and probably breaks a couple of the laws of the game in passing. Academics publish papers for and against the right to abortion, euthanasia, infertility treatments, and universal health care provision all the time, and there is normally no censorship. One person says one thing, the other says another, and the debate goes on unrestrained. Except that reproduction may be another kettle of fish. I know from my own experience that if you want to defend the right to abortion, the safest tactic is to frame it in terms of reproductive autonomy. Women are entitled to choose when and with whom they have children. The default value remains that they will, if they can, eventually have children. Arguments from the low quality of the possible future life meet stronger opposition. Critics are quick to point out that if fetuses can be killed based on bad life prospects, then the same could be applied to infants. And in the bigger picture, the threat of human extinction looms large. If people have bad lives, why don't we just kill them all? As you can imagine, I'm trying to hold back my inner extinctionist with both hands here. Why don't we indeed? Why not end it all? Preparing this presentation brought back a memory from nearly 30 years ago. I mentioned earlier the 1995 paper, Is it undesirable that children are born infected with HIV? The original title was, Is it intolerable that children are born infected with HIV? Women with HIV considered carrying their pregnancies to term with a 50-50 chance that the child will be infected during the delivery. The medication was not developed yet, and the infection would have meant for the child a very short and miserable life, leading to an excruciating death in a few months. I thought that this kind of a gamble would be intolerable, and said so. The audience in Prague, doctors, nurses, and priests, would have none of that. But the treatments are developing all the time, they said. Injections might reduce the risk, they said. Having a child would be the fulfillment of the dying woman's life, they said. How dare I deny her that? And 50-50 are pretty good odds, considering what is at stake, they said. I left the conference, ears burning, promising myself that I will never touch topics like this again. As an aside, meanwhile in Germany, another budding academic drew different conclusions. Karim Akerma, a much more pronounced antinatalist than I was at the time, went on with his agenda with, if I have understood correctly, devastating consequences to his academic career. Unspeakably sad. At the same time, the 1990s, Peter Singer, whose name you may know, was also under attack in Germany. He was seen to advocate the view that since non-human animals can be used in scientific experiments, people with low mental capacities could be used in them as well. As I interpreted the argument, his point was quite the opposite. Since we are reluctant to use humans, however low their mental capacities, in scientific experiments, we should be equally reluctant to use non-humans in them. Be that as it may, Peter came under heavy fire, and even the word bioethics was practically banned in Germany for a while because it was associated with his work. In the United States, bioethics was already a thriving discipline, and Europe followed suit during the next decade or so. Anyway, I began this particular story by telling that Amanda and I were under censorship during the writing of our book. No advocacy, no activism, or there will be no book. Our official response was to say what the editor wanted to hear. There will be no advocacy whatsoever, full stop. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We then went on to write an adamant historical critique of European moral philosophy, claiming that it's nothing but a long series of attempts to curb antinatalism, the only proper response to life's cosmic futility. We followed that up with a bold conceptual account of all sorts of extinction and concluded that consistent antinatalists must at least be amenable to the demise of humankind, maybe other species as well. And we rounded off the proceedings by presenting a fierce normative defense of antinatalism, complete with instructions to practical antinatalists on how to promote the cause. The magic here is in the relentless repetition of the words historical, conceptual, and normative, accompanied by constant reminders that this is a philosophical analysis, not a manual. Smoke and mirrors. But I still haven't answered Lawrence's reasonable question. Why involve extinctionism in the first place? Can we not just advocate pure antinatalism without talking about the demise of species? Long story short, yes, we can, but it comes with a price. Consistent antinatalism does lead to extinction, and that is undeniable. Inconsistent or conditional or temporary or soft antinatalism doesn't, but selective pronatalism is a better name for that. We can, however, at least to some degree save Lawrence's day by resorting to mental reservations. At least two alternatives offer themselves. According to the doctrine of double effect favored by Roman Catholic philosophers, we are allowed to separate the good and the bad outcomes of our actions in a manner that could be useful here. To cite Amanda and myself.
According to the Neo-Thomist doctrine of double effect, an act that has two outcomes, a good one and a bad one, is permissible if four conditions are met. 1. The act is in and of itself morally good, or at least neutral. 2. The bad outcome is not directly willed or intended. 3. The good outcome is not a consequence of the bad outcome. 4. The good outcome is proportionate to the bad outcome. An example of a morally permissible act would be rescuing people from a burning house, even at the cost of breaking arms and legs in the process. This is because 1. Rescuing people is good. 2. The rescuer would avoid doing the damage if it were possible. 3. The broken limbs do not cause the survival of the rescued. And 4. Saving lives at the cost of inflicting reparable harm is proportionate. Could the doctrine be applied to the case of antinatalism and extinction as well?
You can find our full answer in the book, but one thing stands out. The third condition, that we are not allowed to do evil to achieve good, might well be the motivation behind Lawrence's plea. The point would then be that extinction by antinatalism can be at least endurable, while antinatalism by extinction, say by the big red button, cannot. For an extinctionist, this doesn't make any sense, but whatever. The second mental reservation model can be derived from Immanuel Kant's famous moral philosophy, and the Argentinian-Brazilian antinatalist Julio Cabrera has in fact suggested something like it. According to Cabrera, we have a duty not to have children because both procreation and education involve manipulation that cannot be accepted. This idea can be combined with the Kantian notion of duties dictated by the moral law. Fulfilling these duties may, Kant conceded, sometimes lead to really bad consequences. Lying, always forbidden by the moral law, is forbidden even if you could save a life by straying from the truth. A murderer asks whether the intended victim is upstairs, and you have a duty not to lie. Similarly, we may have a moral duty not to have children, although we know that not having children, if observed universally, leads to human extinction. Even if human extinction is seen to be evil, the duty stands. And this is how a non-extinctionist antinatalist can justify the view that only anti-procreation is intended. The rest is just collateral damage. The more general message here could be that merely looking at the outcomes, suffering and misery, may have to be complemented by some rule-based thinking to get the antinatalist message through more widely. Also, you can put a sordino on extinction talk as long as you remember that by advocating antinatalism consistently, you also promote, however indirectly, the eventual demise of at least our species. Thank you. I can't hear you, Lawrence.
You know what? That is the third time today I have forgotten to take myself off mute.
Yes.
So I am single-handedly crippling the technical prowess of this conference. Anyway, so so the first thing I wanted to say was apologies for the technical issues before. So I think what we'll do is we'll extend this session for a few minutes because after this we've only got the closing remarks. So we'll extend this session for a few minutes just so we don't lose out on the question time. So yes, the technical difficulties didn't eat into the question time. Okay, cool. First thing is, thank you, Matti, for preparing the talk. The first question I want to kick off with, and this is more just to, because I know there was a lot of information in there. So this is more just to get a sort of encapsulated answer for people at the back of the class who maybe weren't, keeping up with everything. So in your opinion, can antinatalism legitimately be separated from pro-extinctionism?
Well, yes, that would depend on the definition of antinatalism, because if it means consistent non-reproduction, no children whatsoever, then extinction has to be accepted either as an intended consequence, something that we mean, or at least as a foreseen side effect, something that we don't mean but will happen anyway. Of course, if antinatalism just means having less children, then extinction doesn't come into this picture at all. But it's just that I personally fail to see why antinatalism would be defined as having less children when we can define it as having no children.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So my first proper question that I wanted to dig into is, so the ethics of extinction seem to change depending on the moral status, should we put it, of the beings whose extinction we're considering. So in theory, human extinction can occur entirely voluntarily. Just everyone just throws up their hands and, we sort of fade into the abyss as no one procreates. But in your upcoming book, you deal with the topic of non-human animals or even aliens and their extinction. how do the ethics of extinction change between the circumstances where the beings in question are moral agents deciding for themselves to become extinct, and where moral agents are deciding on behalf of other non-moral agents for them to go extinct? How do those two things differ, and how do they change the ethics of extinction?
Okay, that's a very good question. Do we have 2 hours? I think that I need about that to answer this one. Well, anyways, it's a good question, and it's really easy to answer if your moral theory is traditional negative utilitarianism, because if it is, then you have a duty not to eliminate suffering, both that of your own species and that of other species. So extinction all around, no problem. Agency and autonomy, the things that you mentioned, they are not a part of this puzzle at all. But if your moral theory is something else, it's a different matter. And I have myself struggled with this for years and years and years. So for me, it's kind of clear that factory farming should be stopped. Although this would mean, well, probably, certainly. Although this would mean that some human-bred, non-human species would go extinct, I seem to be okay with that. And I was thinking about that. Why do I think like that? And it's maybe that I'm thinking that factory farm animals are somehow in our care. We have duties to them. This special relationship that we have with them produces for us a duty to end their suffering. So it's not so much that we are entitled, that we have a right to choose for these fellow beings, as it is that we have a duty. We are duty bound to do so because they are there because of us, something like that.
So when it comes to so you obviously are in favor of voluntary human extinction, but not the extinction of wild animals. Where does the difference in your positions on these two groups come from?
Okay, an easy answer and a difficult one. Voluntary human extinction for me is just a simple consequence of my antinatalism. I mean, if my antinatalism means that I don't have children, I don't intend to have children, and I'd be fine with everybody else doing the same. And if everybody stops having children, then eventually there will be no human beings, and then we have all decided that, and nothing controversial about that for me. I don't really believe that there is any value in humankind's continued existence if we collectively, every one of us, have decided that there is none. Other people have other views on this one. And that was the easy one. Then the difficult one, the animals in the wild. I don't know. We can't ask them. And they are not in our custody like factory farm animals are, the explanation that I just made up and inserted into my previous answer. And now I don't know. I can only report my thinking here. I think that they may have some life force of their own that we cannot understand and that we should respect. Like an analogical case for autonomy. I'm all for human autonomy. I'm not killing humankind without everybody's permission here. Well, I might, but that's the other thing. But anyway, if people choose to go extinct, that's their choice, our choice. But is it the choice of chimpanzees, or is it the choice of whales, or butterflies, or antelopes, or lions, or worms? And I don't know. And this is why I'm more cautious about that. Having said that, of course, as far as I know, life in the wild is pretty miserable. And maybe it would be just the kindest thing to stop all the suffering too. But sort of I'm explaining to myself that I don't have to make this choice to be an antinatalist in human matters, because only straightforward negative utilitarians have that problem. And as far as I know, I'm not a straightforward negative utilitarian. I may be a confused negative utilitarian, but I'm not a straightforward.
So You mentioned in your talk David Pearce and a sort of transhumanist answer to the sort of pessimistic evaluation of life. Why, in a sort of nutshell, why are you opposed to the transhumanist approach of removing suffering from sentient experience and pursuing a future of species that way?
The removal of suffering would be obviously a good thing. But it's just that there are, in my axiology, in my theory of value, there are other good things, like ending manipulation between humans. So manipulation from human to human. And my example in our context is just that reproducers have children. And then to justify their choice after the fact, they have to tell their children to have children of their own as well. Because if they tell them not to have children, then children will ask them, "Mommy, Daddy, well, am I unwanted then?" And then it just goes on. And then you have to explain your children that you have to have children. And on it goes, the imposition of the reproductive lifestyle, the imposition of the reproductive breeder's mentality. So even if physical pain, this is to answer your transhumanist removing pain thing, even if physical pain in some simple form could be removed from human lives, then there's the possibility, and I think probability, that frustration and anguish about unequal power relations would still continue, and the world without the ouch effect would not be a paradise, happiness machine or no happiness machine, something like that.
Yeah, and you were kind enough to send me over some material of your upcoming book, and in it you talk about how you sort of view transhumanism as a sort of tech optimism and naivety, and I wanted to ask you, do you think that placing the emphasis of the answer to the the pessimistic value of life on voluntary human extinction is also liable to the same accusation of optimism and naivety when it comes to how plausible it actually is to expect to achieve this? Because voluntary human extinction,
First of all, I do think that transhumanism is a bit naive, but that's just my experience. I've been in this racket for 40 years, and transhumanism, that particular kind, has been around for that 40 years, and I don't see any real development. I know that David Pearce said in a few hundred years, but then that's an awfully long time, and I don't see anything happening. We have more and more gadgets. We may yet fly to the Mars, but I see misery just increasing in the world. So your question then is that if I'm thinking that that's naive, transhumanism is naive, and I think, then would it be naive to think that people stop reproducing as well? Yes, absolutely. That's another thing. So suffering will not be eliminated in our lifetime. Reproduction will not stop in our lifetime. These are wishful thinking. But there is, I think, an important difference in that one is doing a good thing and the other is not. Transhumanism relies, at least in all its current forms that I know of, it relies on perpetual growth, so economic growth, material growth, and that is only making things worse on our limited planet, our planet with some ecological boundaries. And now antinatalism, as far as I can see, is offering the opposite, degrowth, or if that's too thick a concept, then something a little bit of toning down. So anyone joining the antinatalist quest is already a virtuous person, breaking their own omelas, not creating their own omelas, child and what have you, eliminating at least one family line of suffering. But transhumanists, I don't want to accuse anyone, but it's just possible that they are just perpetuating the lifestyle of suffering.
And in again in your upcoming book, you mentioned the sort of famous, infamous red button thought experiment. Can you, just for anyone in the audience who may not be familiar, can you explain what that thought experiment is, and whether you think it's actually useful in discussions about antinatalism?
Sure, yes. First of all, I think that most people here know what the big red button is. It's an imaginary device for ending all life, or all sentient life, or making the whole universe disappear, depending on your definition. It's just you only have to press the button and everything is gone. Is it useful? Well, it's useful for testing your intuitions about extinction, I think. If you think you could or should press it, then you are an extinctionist. You don't then hold human life or sentient life or life in general in any particular awe. And then most people are likely to think that you are a nihilist, cynic, pessimist, and an all-round horrible person. And that's at least the reaction that I get. And then I smile a lot, and they get confused. When I'm being interviewed for antinatalist media, the hosts always want to know what my personal take on the big red button is. Could I press it? Would I press it? Should I press it? And I have different answers to these all. I could. Down there, gone. I probably would, but I couldn't tell anyone beforehand because it's, well, I'll explain that in a bit. But for should I am absolutely in two minds about this. The idea of removing all suffering is tempting. Gone. But then what about my grand talk about autonomy and life force and whatever Elan Vital I've just mentioned? What happened to those? I don't know. I'm thinking that luckily I don't need to know, because the big red button is a thought experiment. I'm stressing that it's a thought experiment, not to be confused with reality in any way. And this is why I probably wouldn't and couldn't tell anyone. Because if someone started building a real life device like that, I fear that it would just end up in tears. People are by and large idiots. And the result would be a nuclear holocaust or something worse. Some life would be wiped out, the rest would be remaining in even more horrible conditions. But your question was, is it a useful tool for in discussions on antinatalism? Well, it's not an antinatalist tool as such. It's an extinctionist tool. As I see it, it can only serve to reinforce the distinction that you have made between the two isms. It's all about the order of things. You can, like yourself, say that extinction by antinatalism, by not having children, would be all right. So if you do it in that order, but then you can still say that antinatalism by extinction, that you stop having children by bottom, you can still say that there's something wrong with that. So that's fair enough. You're right. And
so
I've talking half an hour for nothing.
So I've got one more prepared question, and then we'll go on to audience questions. We might only have time for one or two. But so my last question is, so again, in your incoming, well, it is incoming, but upcoming book, you speak about anti-AI natalism. So the opposition to the creation of artificial sentience that, may or may not be, possible, which, was discussed with David Pearce earlier. So you also speak about a thought experiment by Thomas Metzinger known as the Barn Benevolent Artificial Antinatalism thought experiment. So in this thought experiment, Thomas basically asks us to imagine that a super clever and super compassionate machine could come to understand that humans suffer, but humans are also too biased towards towards existence, to escape their condition themselves. And so the machine could facilitate an ethical extinction. How do you think about or how do you think antinatalists should view the creation of artificial sentience, given this, bearing this thought experiment in mind?
Yes, I think I see two different questions here. One, the creation of artificial sentience, and two, Metzinger's idea. So in that order, artificial sentience first. I think it's a very, very bad idea, because we already have beings capable of suffering here with all the organic life that we have around. And now someone would like to develop machines that can suffer, which is utter nonsense and unkind to the greatest possible degree, especially thinking that then if this is machines, then it goes to mass production. And that means that we have millions, we have billions of new sufferers by that method. So come on, have a heart, have a brain. No, don't do it. So that was my take on developing deliberately sentient artificial intelligence. Metzinger's scenario, on the other hand, that gives me great hope. I mean, oh, fantastic. If only that were. We touch upon that with Amanda Sukenik in our book under the heading of Cunning of Reason. Now, people may not know what that means, so I'll just briefly say that the German Enlightenment philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel had this idea of things happening sort of in this world on their own weight, without any human being deliberately doing. It's not about people's intentions, it's just happening historically. Ideas are developing by themselves, one contradicting the other, and then reaching a higher level together. Now, maybe, just maybe, this is already happening in a world of technology, and we just haven't realized it yet. I mean, as we well know from the Terminator saga, the big machine in there, the Skynet, already became self-aware on August the 29th, 1997. So artificial intelligence has had ample time to develop, to hone the wisdom and compassion that Metzinger is talking about. So perhaps it is, perhaps Skynet or Barn or whatever is preparing to pull the plug as we speak. That would be a very welcome turn of events.
So now I'm going to go on to we maybe only have time for one audience question. We'll see how it goes. But so this question, so other than voluntary peaceful human extinction through non-procreation, are there other means of achieving extinction that you'd find acceptable?
Are there any other ways of going towards not having children and perhaps going extinct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That you would find acceptable, or do you reject all others?
There are many ways. I think that Amanda and I are at the end of our book, the book that wasn't supposed to have any advocacy in it. I think that we are advocating 12 to 13 different solutions, starting with the big red button, then going on to the big blue button, which is that you take the reproductive capacity of people, and the big yellow button, which was something, I don't remember what that one was. Then we had the big green button, which is the abolitionist thing, where the lion lies with the lamb. In the end, human beings will become perhaps softer or go away, and then all the other animals, non-humans, live in peace, and so on and so forth. And then there is the barn, that the technology, the cunning of reason, is already doing it, and then there are many other things. They are more lunatic than well, the next one is always more lunatic than the previous ones. So there is no. If the question was there any sensible way of getting there? Well, I don't know. That's why I'm saying, I said in my presentation and said now, that perhaps this is not about the consequences. Perhaps we shouldn't be just talking about the end result here. We should perhaps be more thinking about our own self-corruption, and thinking that once I don't breed, then at least that's me covered.
Yeah, and you know, obviously there can be debates around which one of those, or if any of them, are sensible. But other than complete voluntary human extinction, are there any that you personally think would be acceptable to pursue?
I can't say anything about that, because if I really had the big red button, which is a thought experiment, so I don't have it, I would press it. But other than that, I don't see any other way than saying, I don't have children, I don't intend to have children. It would be nice if you followed suit in this one, and then one person gets persuaded, the other person gets persuaded, perhaps everybody gets persuaded, and then I'm not holding my breath, because then somebody comes along and we have all the Brave New World and 1984 scenarios, and then we have a noble wild who is procreating, and then we are by the laws of drama, we are drawn to that idiot.
Yeah. So yeah, but either way, I think, you know, both you, myself, and probably everyone watching puts a big emphasis on autonomy, and respecting autonomy. Cool. So I think we're not going to have time for another audience question, just because we've already run over by 6 minutes. But thank you everyone who did submit questions, and thank you, Matti, for, you know, coming on and being part of the first day of the conference and doing this session. We're going to move over into a closing, just a short closing remarks now. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Matti, and see everyone.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matti. Okay, we're on for the closing remarks. I should have asked you if you were ready.
No, don't worry, I am ready. And unlike you, Lawrence, I know where the mute button is. Nice.
I knew that could come out.
I mean, normally, as I said, if anyone saw our pre-conference live stream, they know that I am usually the one who has.
I know, honestly,
the technical sophistication of Fred Flintstone. But well, just in general, I was going to ask, like, how do you feel it's gone, this first part of our conference?
Yeah, good. I mean, yeah, as you said, like, there's been a complete role reversal in boomerism. But no, in general, I've really enjoyed it. I think it went well. Minor issues, you know, and any issues we did have, we overcame. But yeah, I think it's gone well. There's been a lot of people tuning in, and I think you know, the chat's been very very active.
Yeah, a lively but respectful chat, which is exactly what you want. Audience questions have been great as well. We, as you're saying, Lawrence, we sadly couldn't get to all of them, but yeah, it's been great. Thank you everyone for sending those questions in. As we keep on saying, this is the first part of our conference. We are obviously going to be back tomorrow for part 2, so please do tune in for that. And as Lawrence, now, I mentioned at the beginning, actually, in the housekeeping, but I think you mentioned as well that there will be a newsletter going out at the end of today with all the links for speakers. We're going to wait a couple of hours before that goes out, so please do make sure that you subscribe to that. And there is a link in the YouTube description. And as I said, we're going to wait a couple of hours for people to subscribe before they get that. And yeah, we will hopefully be seeing some of you at the post-conference hangout on Discord. So please do come along and say hi. And play nice as well, as you have been doing in the chat.
Yeah, if people want to come to the hangout, please go to the description of the video or the description of the stream, and you'll be able to find a link there that takes you to Discord, and you can then join the Discord, and we will you know, let you in, and we'll have the post-conference hangout. The post-conference hangout will probably begin officially about 10 minutes after we actually finish this stream, because John and I, you know, we need to get a few things together and stuff like that, and have a bit of a break before we go into the post-conference hangout. So there'll probably be about a 10-minute delay. but hopefully, loads of you will be able to join anyway. One other thing I wanted to say, we won't be sending it out today, but I wanted to mention it, is that quite soon after the weekend, after the whole conference is finished, we will be sending out another newsletter. So please subscribe with a feedback form. And we want to get people's feedback because we want to make the next conference even better than this one. And you can give feedback on any aspect about the conference you want, about the speakers that came on, about the questions we asked, about the technical side of things, about the advertisement prior, everything. So yeah, definitely fill that in and subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't already. So John, should we quickly do a bit of a quickly give our thoughts on the sessions we hosted? Do you want to go first? What were your sort of thoughts on Seb Alex's talk?
Well, I mean, it was great to hear it. I think just from my own personal philosophical perspective, as someone who is a bit of a utilitarian, it was good to be put in my place for some of the very unethical positions that utilitarianism leads you to. And yeah, it was really great to get a history of animal rights too, and like how it's developed and the different kind of objections that people have to it, and also what the practical implications are for antinatalists in terms of wild animal suffering, in terms of whether or not the message should go together. And yeah, I thought it was great, and I do hope that people enjoyed that style of talk, because definitely with the conference going forward, and certainly tomorrow as well, when we've got Oscar Horter on to talk about wild animal suffering. We could have every talk about like human procreation, or just kind of what people might view of as the core topics that we all agree on, but we think that would be quite dull. So we're really keen to get people on, like David Pearce as well, with his transhumanism, people who don't necessarily, who don't obviously agree with everything that we're saying, or what people might think of as an antinatalist conference. So please do let us know if you do like that style of session where we focus on an issue which is related to antinatalism, and really dig deep into that one by getting on someone whose expertise is in that field.
Yeah, so for David Pearce, I mean, first of all, I just want to say how nice all of the speakers have been today as people. They're just all very genuinely nice people. But yeah, so with David's session, the biggest, the most value I get from David's session, or just his commentary generally, is the critique about how optimistic, ironically, so how optimistic antinatalists can be about like what, what we could, not in terms of the philosophy, but how optimistic we can be in terms of what impact we think we can have. I think he launches like very valid critiques and proposes an alternative that, many people will see as viable, others will see as not viable, others won't know. I'm in the camp of, I just don't know. Like, honestly, especially with, all of the current events going on, I just don't know what the future of humanity is going to be, what our capacities are going to be in the future. Are we going to go forwards? Are we going to go backwards in terms of our technological capacities, our moral progress? It's just all so uncertain to me. So I find it hard to be sure in that the transhumanist answer is a viable one. Whether or not it's more viable, I don't know, because that's a relative term. So it may be more viable than antinatalism, but honestly, I don't know. But I really appreciate his proposal of an alternative and the critiques he makes of antinatalists and their what they pursue, because I think it's good to have people to push back and make you think at the very least. With Matty, the most interesting thing that I think people can take away from Matty's talk is that the decoupling of antinatalism the decoupling of extinction from antinatalism is something that has a different answer depending on the ethical system you're working within, right? So, he was using an example of negative utilitarianism, and he was saying, it's very clear how a negative utilitarian can decouple antinatalism from extinction, or at least, if you're defining antinatalism as not having children. But it's not as clear under other ethical systems, and I think that's like the most valuable. I mean, there were many valuable things, but I think if someone wants to take home a simple takeaway message from Matty's talk, that to me seems like the best one. I don't know if you had any comments on either of David or Matty's, or
Yeah, definitely. Unfortunately, my audience question that I submitted didn't get put through by the moderator. You know who you are, which suggested, that you and Matty could have like a rap battle, or even like, a cage fight maybe to sort out this beef.
Yeah.
No, I think it was fantastic, and again, a really nice contrast to David Pearce's talk at the beginning.
Yeah, 100%.
It was great to get those perspectives, and I think all of the talks today and throughout the conference, they will talk. It goes to show how there are people with different focuses, but we are all united by one kind of common underlying position, and that is that it's the recognition about the suffering and the risks that sentient existence brings, and a real desire to do something about it. And hopefully that was the common thread throughout all the talks today.
Yeah. Actually, one thing I will say is, even though I put myself on mute, I heard your phone vibrating at multiple times throughout the. So we've both been gnawing away at the legitimacy of our tech skills.
That's true. We've got tomorrow to improve on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think apart from reminding people to sign up to the newsletter and to join us at the Hangout in sort of 10 minutes or so, I think we can round it off there and see people tomorrow. Do you have anything else you want to put in before we end?
No, just another big thank you. And it'll be evening for us tomorrow, 18:50 GMT. But whatever time it is for you guys, really hope to see you there for some more great talks.
Yeah, and one thing just very quickly before we finish, I see someone asking in the chat. Yes, all of the individual talks and the whole stream will be available to watch after the fact. So don't worry if you don't make all of it or any of it live. It'll all be available afterwards.
Definitely.
Great. See everyone tomorrow at the second day 2 of AAC 23. If not, seeing you before at the post-conference hangout. So see you in 10 minutes or tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.